There are moments in history when the impossible walks into the ordinary world and changes everything. This is the story of one small American town where that line blurred completely. For 13 months, residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, reported encounters with something that defied explanation. A creature with glowing red eyes and wings like an aircraft. A figure that appeared in the darkness and vanished without sound. And then, on a cold December afternoon, tragedy struck. And the sightings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Was it coincidence? Mass hysteria? Or was something trying to warn a town that wouldn't listen? This is the story of the Mothman, a phenomenon so strange that it has haunted investigators for more than 50 years, a mystery that sits at the intersection of cryptozoology, ufology, and prophecy, a series of events that challenged everything witnesses thought they knew about reality. What you're about to hear is based on documented testimony from more than 100 witnesses, police reports filed in real time, newspaper accounts from the period, the exhaustive investigation conducted by journalist John Keel, who spent over a year in Point Pleasant documenting every detail he could find. This isn't a campfire story embellished for effect. This is what happened when something impossible appeared in a small American town and refused to be ignored. When reality bent just enough for witnesses to see through to something else. When a messenger arrived with a warning that nobody could understand until it was too late. The Ohio River runs through West Virginia like a vein of dark water, separating states and connecting communities. In November of 1966, that river bordered a town that was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. A town where something with wings and burning eyes would appear night after night, creating a pattern of fear and strangeness that would end only when tragedy claimed 46 lives, in a single catastrophic moment. This is Point Pleasant. This is the Mothman, and this is what happened when the impossible refused to stay hidden. Chapter 1. The First Encounter. The night of November 15, 1966 was unseasonably warm for late autumn in West Virginia. The temperature had climbed into the mid-60s during the day, and even after sunset the air remained mild. Two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallett, were driving near an abandoned World War II munitions plant just outside Point Pleasant. The area, known locally as the TNT area, had been closed since the end of the war, its network of concrete bunkers and storage igloos left to decay among the overgrown fields. They were looking for friends, driving the quiet back roads that wound through the old industrial site. Roger was at the wheel of his car, a Chevrolet that he kept in good condition. Linda sat beside him in the passenger seat. Steve and Mary were in the back talking quietly about their plans for the coming week. It was meant to be an ordinary night, a casual drive through familiar territory, nothing more. But as Roger guided the car past one of the massive concrete domes that dotted the landscape, Linda saw something that made her grip the dashboard hard enough that her knuckles went white. Near the entrance to an old power plant, two enormous red lights hovered in the darkness. At first, she thought they might be reflections, maybe tail lights from another vehicle, or some trick of the moon. But these lights weren't reflecting anything. They had depth. They had presence. They glowed with their own internal illumination, steady and unwavering in the night air. And they were eyes. Roger slowed the car instinctively, his foot easing off the accelerator as he tried to process what he was seeing. The lights didn't move. They remained fixed in position, roughly 6 feet off the ground, separated by a distance that suggested they belonged to something large, something that was watching them. Then the shape around those eyes became visible, a figure standing upright in the shadows near the power plant entrance, taller than any man Roger had ever seen, at least 6.5 feet, maybe 7. Its body was grey and muscular, humanoid in basic structure but wrong in every proportion. The torso was too thick, the limbs were too long, and there was no visible neck. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, creating a silhouette that violated every expectation of how a standing figure should look. Steve leaned forward from the back seat, his voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" Nobody answered. They were all staring at the same impossible thing. The creature shifted its weight, and that simple movement revealed something even more disturbing. From its back rose wings, massive appendages that had been folded against its frame, but were now becoming visible in the dim light. They weren't feathered like a bird's wings. They had a leathery quality like the wings of a bat, but impossibly large. Even folded, they created a cape-like silhouette that made the creature look even more imposing. For a moment, that felt like an hour nobody moved. The creature stood perfectly still, its red eyes fixed on the car. Roger's hand remained frozen on the steering wheel. Linda's breath came in short, shallow gasps. In the back seat, Mary had gone completely silent, her hand clutching Steve's arm with enough force to leave marks. Then the creature moved. Its wings unfolded with a sound like heavy canvas snapping in wind. The span was enormous. Roger would later estimate 10 feet, though in the moment it seemed to fill his entire field of vision. The wings spread wide, and then the creature simply lifted off the ground. There was no running start, no awkward flapping as it gained altitude. It rose vertically into the air with smooth, deliberate power, its wings beating with slow, purposeful strokes. Roger didn't make a conscious decision to drive away. His body took over, his foot slamming down on the accelerator before his brain fully processed what it had seen. The tyres spun on the gravel road, kicking up stones that rattled against the undercarriage. The car lurched forward, engine roaring as Roger pushed it faster than was safe on these narrow roads. But the thing followed. It stayed just behind them at first, wings beating steadily as it matched their speed with what seemed like minimal effort. Then it moved to the side, paralleling the car as they raced down the winding road. Roger could see it in his peripheral vision. A massive shape keeping pace, those red eyes glowing steadily in the darkness. Linda was screaming now, her voice high and terrified. Mary had her hands over her face, unable to look. Steve was turned in his seat, watching the creature through the rear window, his face pale in the dashboard light. Roger pushed the car faster, 50 miles per hour, 60. The speedometer climbed to 70 on a road where 40 was dangerously fast. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and abandoned structures that blurred past. But the creature kept pace. It didn't struggle. It didn't fall behind. It simply flew alongside them as if their desperate speed was nothing more than a leisurely pace. They passed through a section of road bordered by thick woods on both sides. Roger prayed the creature would lose sight of them, that the trees would provide some kind of barrier. But when they emerged into open fields, it was still there, still following, still watching with those burning red eyes. The chase continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as they approached the main highway and the lights of Point Pleasant became visible ahead, the creature made a final move. It rose higher into the air, gaining altitude with a few powerful wing beats. It circled once above the car, a massive silhouette against the stars, and then it simply vanished. Not flew away into the distance, not disappeared behind trees or buildings. It was there one moment, wings spread, eyes glowing, and gone the next, as if it had never existed at all. Roger didn't slow down until they were well into town, surrounded by streetlights and traffic and the blessed normalcy of civilization. He pulled into the parking lot of the Mason County Courthouse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the ignition. They sat in silence for a long moment, all four of them breathing hard, trying to convince themselves that what they'd just experienced had actually happened. Finally Steve spoke. "We need to tell someone." Deputy Millard Halstead was on duty that night, working the evening shift at the courthouse. He'd been a law enforcement officer for over a decade, and he'd heard his share of strange reports. But when the four young people walked into his office just after midnight, he could see immediately that something had genuinely terrified them. Roger Scarberry's hands were still trembling. Linda's face was tear-streaked and pale. Steve kept running his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he seemed unable to control. Mary hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, just sat in the chair Halstead offered her and stared at the floor. They were scared. Not drunk, not high, not pulling a prank. They were genuinely, profoundly frightened by something they'd seen. Halstead took their report with the seriousness it deserved. He knew these people. Roger worked construction jobs around town. He was a solid, reliable guy who showed up on time and did good work. Steve Millett was employed at a local plant, married, starting a family. These weren't troublemakers or attention seekers looking to cause a stir. These were ordinary people who had encountered something extraordinary. He took detailed notes as they described what they'd seen, the location near the old power plant at the TNT area. The creature's appearance, humanoid but wrong, with massive wings and glowing red eyes. The way it had moved, lifting straight up into the air, matching their car's speed effortlessly, disappearing without flying away. When they finished their account, Halstead made a decision that would prove significant. He drove out to the TNT area himself that night, taking another deputy with him. They brought high-powered flashlights and searched the area around the power plant where the creature had first been seen. They found nothing. No creature, no footprints, no physical evidence of anything unusual. The old power plant stood silent and abandoned, its windows broken and its machinery long since removed. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. But Halstead filed an official report nonetheless. He documented the sighting with precise detail, noting the time, the location, the description provided by all four witnesses, and his own search of the area. He treated it as he would any legitimate incident, because as far as he could tell, it was legitimate. These people had seen something. They couldn't all be mistaken. They couldn't all be lying. The report went into the official record. A creature with wings and glowing red eyes. Something that could fly at 70 miles per hour. Something that watched from the darkness at the edge of town. By sunrise, the story had spread through Point Pleasant like wildfire. People talked about it at breakfast diners and coffee shops. They discussed it at work and in passing on the street. The reactions were mixed. Some people dismissed it as nonsense, but many others listened with interest and concern. Point Pleasant was a small town. When 4 residents reported something this strange, people paid attention. Within 48 hours, a reporter from the local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, had interviewed the witnesses and written an article. The headline read, "Couple see man-sized bird, creature, something." The article treated the report seriously, noting that the witnesses were credible and that law enforcement had taken the matter seriously enough to investigate. The story was picked up by regional papers, then by wire services. Within a week, Point Pleasant was receiving attention from newspapers across the country. The creature needed a name, and a reporter at the Ohio newspaper came up with one inspired by a Batman villain that had recently appeared on television, Mothman. The name stuck, and the sightings were just beginning. Chapter 2. The TNT Area. To understand why Point Pleasant became the centre of this phenomenon, you have to understand the TNT area. The location wasn't just an abandoned industrial site. It was a sprawling complex with a dark history that stretched back to America's involvement in World War II. In 1942, as the United States mobilized for war, the federal government identified a need for massive increases in explosive production. They chose a site just outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia, for a new facility that would manufacture TNT on an unprecedented scale. The location was ideal, close to the Ohio River for shipping, near rail lines for transport, and remote enough that accidents wouldn't threaten major population centres. Construction began immediately. The West Virginia Ordnance Works, as it was officially known, covered several thousand acres of former farmland and forest. The facility included manufacturing buildings, storage bunkers, administrative offices, worker housing, and an extensive network of roads connecting all the components. The storage bunkers, called igloos because of their distinctive dome shape, were engineering marvels designed to contain explosive materials safely. Each igloo was a massive concrete structure, partially buried in artificial hillsides with reinforced doors and ventilation systems designed to prevent accidental detonation. At peak operation, the facility contained hundreds of these storage units, each one capable of holding tons of high explosives. Thousands of people worked at the ordnance facility during the war. They manufactured TNT, processed chemical compounds, loaded munitions, and maintained the complex machinery required for industrial-scale explosive production. The work was dangerous. There were accidents, chemical burns, explosions, injuries from heavy machinery. But the facility operated around the clock, producing the material that would fuel the Allied war effort. When the war ended, the facility was decommissioned. The manufacturing equipment was removed or dismantled. The workers dispersed. The administrative buildings were emptied. But the igloos remained, too massive and too expensive to demolish. They were simply sealed and abandoned. By the 1960s, the TNT area had become a strange landscape of industrial ruins. The concrete igloos dotted the fields like ancient burial mounds. The roads had cracked and been reclaimed by weeds. The administrative buildings had been vandalised, their windows broken, and their interiors stripped of anything valuable. The entire site was officially restricted. No trespassing signs were posted, and occasionally police would patrol. But it was impossible to truly secure thousands of acres of empty land. Local teenagers used the area for parties. Hunters knew the deer were plentiful in the abandoned fields. Couples sometimes drove the back roads for privacy. Everyone in Point Pleasant knew the TNT area, and despite the official restrictions, many people had been there at one time or another. But the area had always had a reputation for strangeness. Even before the Mothman sightings began, people reported unusual experiences there. Lights moving between the igloos at night, not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but unexplained illumination that seemed to float through the air. Strange humming, or vibrating sounds that seemed to come from underground, as if machinery was still operating in sealed spaces below the surface. The feeling of being watched when walking through the ruins, even when no one else was visible. Some of this could be explained. The bunkers were connected by underground tunnels. Some people claimed there was an entire network of passages beneath the surface, though this was never officially confirmed. Animals made dens in the abandoned structures. The wind created odd acoustics when it moved through broken buildings and concrete passages. But the reputation persisted. The TNT area was a place where things felt wrong. After the Scarberry Mallet sighting, investigators began examining why so many encounters with the Mothman occurred at or near this location. The bunkers provided shelter. If the creature was physical, it could hide in the sealed igloos or the underground tunnels. The remote location offered privacy. The creature could move through the area without constant human observation. The proximity to the Ohio River provided access to water and potentially to a wider range of territory if the creature could fly. But some researchers suggested more exotic explanations. The ground at the TNT area was contaminated with chemicals from wartime production. Decades of TNT manufacturing had left residues in the soil and groundwater, compounds that could affect both human perception and potentially attract or enable unusual phenomena. Some theorists pointed to reports of radioactive materials having been stored at the facility during the war, though documentation of this was scarce. Others noted the electromagnetic properties of the location. The Ohio River Valley was known for unusual lightning activity. The limestone geology of the region could create piezoelectric effects under stress. The presence of underground water and metal infrastructure might create electromagnetic anomalies. If the Mothman phenomenon was somehow related to unusual energy fields or dimensional boundaries, the TNT area might provide ideal conditions. John Keel, who had arrived to investigate a few weeks after the first sighting, noted that the TNT area functioned almost like a stage set. The massive concrete structures provided dramatic backdrop. The open fields between igloos offered clear sightlines for witnesses. The darkness between structures created pockets of shadow where something could appear and disappear. It was, he observed, almost perfectly designed for a phenomenon that wanted to be seen but not captured or examined closely. The igloos themselves were deeply unsettling even in full daylight. They rose from the hillsides like ancient temples, their concrete surfaces weathered and stained. The steel doors were massive, designed to contain explosive force, and many had rusted partially open or been torn away entirely. Inside, Darkness stretched back into artificial caves that smelled of decay, dampness and lingering chemicals. Some igloos had collapsed partially, their concrete shells cracked open to reveal the rebar reinforcement within. Others remained intact but ominous, their interiors invisible from the outside. At night, the TNT area became something else entirely. The lack of artificial light meant true darkness, the kind that city dwellers rarely experience. The stars were visible in stunning clarity, but they only made the ground-level shadows deeper. The concrete igloos became indistinct shapes in the blackness. The trees along the access roads rustled with movements that could be wind or animals, or something else entirely. And after November 15, 1966, dozens of people would report seeing the Mothman in this landscape, standing atop the igloos with wings spread, crouched near the entrances to the underground bunkers, moving between structures with fluid, inhuman grace. Always watching, always visible just long enough to be seen clearly, always vanishing before anyone could get close enough to verify what they were actually looking at. The creature had found its territory, or perhaps the territory had called to the creature. Either way, the TNT area and the Mothman would become forever linked in the public imagination, a place where reality bent and something impossible made itself known. Chapter 3. Sightings multiply. Within days of the first report making the newspapers, more witnesses came forward. Not just young couples driving at night, but residents from all walks of life who had seen something they couldn't explain. Some had encountered the creature before the Scarberry Mallet sighting, but had been too frightened or embarrassed to report it. Others were having experiences in the aftermath, as if the creature was becoming more active or more visible. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had no contact with each other. Height consistently estimated between 6 and 7 feet when the figure stood upright. Colouring described as grey or brownish grey, sometimes with a slightly metallic sheen in certain light. Muscular build with clearly defined limbs, but proportions that were distinctly non-human. The torso was described as thick and powerful. The arms were long. Witnesses noted that when the creature stood with arms at its sides, the hands hung past where human hands would reach. But the most consistent elements were the wings and the eyes. The wings were universally described as massive. Conservative estimates put the wingspan at 10 feet, though some witnesses insisted they were larger. When folded, they created a cape-like silhouette down the creature's back. When extended, they blocked out significant portions of sky or background structures. Witnesses struggled to describe the texture. Some said leathery like a bat, others said more like folded fabric. Still others couldn't categorize it at all beyond not feathers. And the eyes, every witness mentioned the eyes, they were large, much larger than human eyes, and positioned in what seemed like a standard facial arrangement, though many witnesses noted that they couldn't see other facial features clearly. The eyes glowed red, not reflected light the way animal eyes shine when caught in headlights. These eyes produced their own illumination, glowing with internal light that remained constant regardless of external lighting conditions. The psychological effect of those eyes was profound. Multiple witnesses described feeling hypnotized or frozen when the creature looked directly at them. Several people reported that the eyes seemed to convey intelligence, not animal cunning, but actual awareness and thought. One witness said the eyes felt ancient and knowing. Another described them as looking through me, not at me. The encounters followed geographical and temporal patterns that would become significant to later analysis. The creature appeared most frequently in the TNT area, but sightings extended across a wider region. It was spotted along the Ohio River waterfront, near the Point Pleasant power plant, in residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, along Route 62 heading north, at intersections where power lines crossed the road. Temporarily, sightings clustered in the evening and nighttime hours, between dusk and midnight most commonly, though there were reports from as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. But there were also several daylight encounters, which complicated theories that the creature was purely nocturnal, or that witnesses were mistaking known animals in darkness. The behaviour patterns were equally consistent and equally strange. The creature didn't attack. Despite dozens of close encounters over the coming months, no one was ever physically harmed by the Mothman. It didn't approach people aggressively. It didn't make threatening gestures. It simply appeared and watched. Sometimes it would follow cars as it had followed the Scarberries and mallets. These pursuit incidents were particularly terrifying for those who experienced them. The creature would pace vehicles at high speeds, 60, 70 miles per hour, apparently without effort. Witnesses described its flight as smooth and effortless, with slow wing beats that seemed insufficient for the speed it maintained. Some pursuers reported that the creature would fly alongside the car close enough that they could see details of its form. Others said it stayed behind the vehicle, visible in the rearview mirror, its eyes glowing steadily in the darkness. Other times the creature would be spotted stationary, standing on a rooftop, perched on a power line, positioned atop one of the TNT igloos. In these encounters it would remain motionless for extended periods, sometimes several minutes, giving witnesses ample time to observe. Then it would depart, sometimes flying away with visible wing beats, other times simply ceasing to be there. Multiple witnesses described this. Instantaneous disappearance. The creature would be clearly visible one moment and completely gone the next, with no transition period and no visible departure. The sounds associated with the creature were minimal and inconsistent. Some witnesses reported no sound at all. The creature flew silently, its wing beats producing no audible noise. Others described a faint rustling or whooshing sound when the wings moved. A few reported hearing a high-pitched shriek or squeak, though this was less common and might have been from other sources. No witness ever reported the creature making human-like vocalizations or attempting to communicate through sound. Physical evidence was frustratingly absent. No footprints were found, despite searches of areas where the creature had been seen standing. No feathers or fragments were recovered. No photographs captured clear images. Cameras of the era required good lighting and steady subjects, and the Mothman appeared in darkness and moved unpredictably. Several people attempted photographs, but the results were either too dark to show detail or too blurry to be useful. On November the 17th, just 2 days after the Scarberry Mallet encounter, a volunteer firefighter named Harold Stanton reported seeing the creature in his backyard. He was letting his dog out just before midnight when the animal began barking frantically at something near the tree line. Stanton stepped outside with a flashlight and swept the beam across his property. The light caught red eyes 20 feet away. The creature was standing upright near a large oak tree, wings folded against its back. For several seconds, Stanton and the creature stared at each other. Then the Mothman unfolded its wings. Stanton would later say they extended to at least 12 feet, and lifted straight up into the air. It cleared the tree line and disappeared into the night sky. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but Stanton was shaken enough that he called the sheriff's department to report it. On November 24, a young woman named Connie Carpenter had an encounter that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was driving home from her parents' house, taking a route that passed near the TNT area. It was around 9 in the evening, fully dark, and the road was empty of other traffic. As she rounded a curve, something large and grey dropped from the sky and landed on the road directly ahead of her car. She slammed on the brakes, her tyres squealing as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. The creature stood in her headlight beams, facing her. Its wings were spread partially, creating a shape that filled the width of the narrow road. Its eyes reflected her headlights with that distinctive red glow. Carpenter sat frozen, her hands locked on the steering wheel, unable to move. The creature took several steps toward her car. She would later describe its gait as awkward but powerful, like something that wasn't designed for walking but could do so when necessary. It approached within 10 feet of her front bumper. Then it simply stepped aside, moved to the shoulder of the road, and with several powerful wing beats launched itself back into the air. Carpenter sat in her stopped car for several more minutes, crying and shaking, before she could compose herself enough to drive home. These were just a few of the encounters during those first weeks. The Point Pleasant Register was documenting as many reports as possible, and Mary Heyer, the paper's lead reporter on the story, was quickly becoming overwhelmed by the volume of accounts. People called her office constantly. Some wanted to report sightings, others wanted information about what was happening. Still others were terrified and looking for reassurance that something was being done. The Mason County Sheriff's Department was receiving calls as well. Some were clearly pranks, teenagers calling in false sightings as jokes. But many were legitimate reports from frightened residents who had seen something they couldn't explain. Deputies found themselves driving out to investigate sighting locations multiple times per night, though they never found the creature themselves. The attention from outside media intensified. Reporters from Charleston and Huntington arrived to interview witnesses and tour the TNT area. Television crews came from as far away as Pittsburgh. The Associated Press picked up the story, and suddenly Point Pleasant was national news. A small West Virginia town was being visited by something impossible, and the world was paying attention. The reactions among townspeople varied widely. Some embraced the attention and the uniqueness of the situation. The local business community saw opportunity. Restaurants and motels were filling with visiting reporters and curious tourists. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight, feeling that their town was being made to look foolish or backward. But the fear was real and widespread. Parents kept children indoors after dark. Schools noticed decreased attendance at evening activities and sporting events. Gun sales increased at local sporting goods stores as people sought protection against an unknown threat. Some residents installed additional outdoor lighting. Others avoided driving alone at night, especially near the TNT area. The creature seemed utterly indifferent to the disruption it was causing. The sightings continued with the same frequency and the same patterns. It appeared, it watched, it vanished. And with each new encounter, the mystery deepened. What was this thing? Where had it come from? What did it want? And most disturbingly, why Point Pleasant? Those questions would attract the attention of a journalist who specialised in exactly these kinds of unexplained phenomena. A man who would spend the next 13 months documenting every detail of the Mothman encounters and developing theories that would challenge conventional understanding of reality itself. His name was John Keel, and his arrival in Point Pleasant would transform the investigation from local mystery to national phenomenon. Chapter 4. John Keel enters the story. John Alver Keel was not a typical paranormal investigator. Born in 1930, he had worked as a journalist, radio scriptwriter, and author specialising in unusual phenomena. By the mid-1960s, he had established himself as one of the more serious researchers in the field of UFOs and unexplained events. Unlike many investigators who approached these topics as true believers or determined debunkers, Keel maintained a position of informed skepticism. He was willing to investigate with an open mind, but he demanded evidence and looked for patterns rather than accepting sensational claims at face value. When Keel heard about the Point Pleasant sightings in December of 1966, his initial interest was professional curiosity. Strange creature reports weren't uncommon, and most could be explained as misidentification, hoaxes, or exaggeration. But something about the Point Pleasant case intrigued him. The number of witnesses was unusually high. The consistency of descriptions across independent reports suggested something more than mass hysteria, and the involvement of law enforcement, who were taking the reports seriously rather than dismissing them, indicated this wasn't a simple prank or media invention. Keel arrived in Point Pleasant in mid-December, expecting to spend perhaps a week gathering information for an article. He checked into a local motel, contacted the newspaper to review their files, and began the methodical process of interviewing witnesses. What he found surprised him. The witnesses were credible. Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette. These weren't attention seekers or people prone to making up stories. They were genuinely traumatized by what they had experienced. Keel had interviewed enough false witnesses over the years to recognize the difference between fabrication and authentic experience. These people had seen something that terrified them, and they were still processing the psychological impact. He interviewed Connie Carpenter, who broke down crying as she described the creature blocking the road in front of her car. He spoke with Harold Stanton, the firefighter who had seen it in his backyard. He tracked down other witnesses who hadn't made official reports but had shared their experiences with friends or family. Each interview added detail and consistency to the overall picture. Keel also interviewed the skeptics, people who believed the sightings were misidentifications of known animals or hoaxes. He listened to their arguments carefully. Sandhill cranes, some suggested. Large birds with red patches and impressive wingspans that migrated through the region. But the described wingspan was too large, the flight capabilities too advanced, and Sandhill cranes didn't have glowing eyes or hover in place. Large owls, others proposed. But no owl species reached 7 feet in height or could pace a car at 70 miles per hour. The hoax theory was more difficult to dismiss entirely, but it had significant problems. How would hoaxers create a creature that could fly convincingly? How would they coordinate appearances across multiple locations on the same nights? Why would they target this specific area? And most significantly, why had no one involved in such a hoax come forward to claim credit or been caught in the act? With dozens of sightings over multiple weeks, someone should have slipped up if this was an elaborate prank. Keel spent time at the TNT area, walking through the abandoned bunkers and storage igloos during both day and night. The location was genuinely eerie. He could understand why unusual reports might cluster there, but he found no evidence of hoaxers, no equipment or materials that might be used to create a fake creature, just empty concrete, structures slowly being reclaimed by nature. As he continued his investigation, Keel began documenting phenomena that extended beyond simple creature sightings. Witnesses reported electrical disturbances before or after encounters. Television sets would malfunction, static replacing the picture, or the picture appearing but with severe distortion. Phones would ring with no one on the line, or callers who asked strange questions and disconnected abruptly. Some witnesses described physical sensations after sightings, burning sensations in their eyes that lasted for hours or days, headaches that came on suddenly and severely, feelings of being watched even when alone in their homes. Several people reported nightmares featuring the creature or related imagery, dark wings, glowing eyes, the sensation of flying or falling. Keel himself began experiencing unusual phenomena. His phone at the motel would ring at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, and when he answered, he would hear strange sounds or voices that seemed artificially generated. Sometimes the voice would deliver cryptic messages. You should leave Point Pleasant. Stop asking questions. You cannot understand what is happening. Other times the calls consisted only of electronic tones or static that felt somehow purposeful rather than random. His mail was tampered with. Letters he sent to colleagues took weeks to arrive or never reached their destination. Mail he received was opened and resealed. He noticed his room was being searched when he was out. Nothing stolen, but items moved slightly from their original positions. He began setting small traps. A hair placed across a drawer, a piece of paper positioned carefully on his suitcase. Every time he returned from an interview or research trip, the traps had been disturbed. Keel was an experienced enough investigator to recognize surveillance and intimidation when he experienced them. But who was conducting this operation? Local authorities had no reason to interfere with his investigation. They were cooperative and interested in his findings. Federal agencies seemed unlikely unless there was some classified project he'd stumbled into. But the behaviour of his surveillors felt wrong, too obvious, too theatrical, as if the point was to be noticed rather than to conduct effective clandestine observation. He began keeping meticulous records of everything. He documented each witness interview with detailed notes, recording dates, times, locations, and specific descriptions. He mapped sighting locations on detailed charts of the area, looking for geographical patterns. He tracked the dates and times of all reported encounters, searching for temporal patterns. He maintained a separate log of anomalous phone calls and surveillance incidents. The patterns he discovered were fascinating and disturbing. Sightings clustered around specific dates, particularly around major holidays or periods of community stress. They concentrated geographically near the TNT area, but also appeared along specific roads and near electrical infrastructure. They increased during periods when unusual lights had been reported in the night sky over the Ohio River Valley. Keel also noticed something that would become central to his later theorizing. The creature's behavior didn't match biological patterns. It appeared and disappeared with no regard for physical constraints. It flew in ways that defied aerodynamics. It showed no signs of needing to eat, rest, or maintain a dwelling. It was seen in multiple locations on the same nights at times that would require impossibly rapid travel. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't even a cryptid in the traditional sense. A hidden species living in remote areas and occasionally crossing paths with humans. This was something else entirely. Something that operated according to different rules. Something that seemed to exist partially outside normal physical reality. Keel had investigated UFO cases, where witnesses reported similar qualities, craft that defied physics, entities that appeared and disappeared, experiences that felt more like hallucinations than physical encounters, but left physical evidence behind. He began wondering if the Mothman was related to the broader phenomenon he'd been investigating for years. Not an extraterrestrial visitor, but something that existed in dimensions or states that occasionally intersected with human reality. He expanded his investigation beyond the creature sightings. He interviewed people who reported unusual lights over the Ohio River. He documented strange sounds that several residents reported hearing, low-frequency humming that seemed to come from underground or from the sky. He collected accounts of premonitions and prophetic dreams that had increased in frequency since the sightings began. The more Keel investigated, the stranger the picture became. Point Pleasant wasn't just experiencing creature sightings, it was experiencing a full spectrum of high strangeness, a term Keel used to describe events that defied conventional explanation and seemed to cluster in specific locations during specific time periods. And he began to suspect that the sightings weren't random. They were building toward something. The creature was appearing with increasing frequency. The intensity of encounters was escalating. Witnesses were having more profound psychological and physical reactions. Everything felt like preparation or warning, though for what Keel couldn't yet determine. He decided to stay in Point Pleasant. Not for a week, but for as long as the phenomenon continued. He rented a longer-term accommodation, established relationships with local witnesses and authorities, and committed himself to documenting every aspect of what was happening. What he didn't know was that he was documenting the build-up to tragedy. That in exactly 1 year, the reason for all the strangeness would become horrifyingly clear. That the Mothman wasn't just a mystery to be solved, it was a warning that nobody could interpret until it was too late. Chapter 5. The Men in Black Reports. As the winter of 1966 progressed, and the Mothman sightings continued, another phenomenon emerged that would complicate the investigation and push the events firmly into conspiracy territory. Witnesses began receiving visits from strange men who asked questions about their encounters. These weren't journalists or researchers like Keel. They weren't police officers conducting official investigations. They were something else entirely, something that witnesses struggled to categorize or explain. The first reports came in late December. Mary Heyer, the Point Pleasant Register reporter who was covering the Mothman story extensively, received a visit at her office from 2 men in dark suits. They identified themselves as representatives of a government agency she'd never heard of, showing badges that looked official but featured insignia she couldn't identify. They asked detailed questions about her reporting, which witnesses she'd interviewed, what information she'd gathered, whether she'd discovered any physical evidence of the creature. Heyer found the interaction deeply unsettling. The men's behaviour was formal to the point of robotic. They spoke in stilted, overly precise language. Would you be willing to share information regarding the encounters you have documented, rather than can you tell us about the sightings you've covered? Their facial expressions were fixed and unnatural. They didn't blink with normal frequency. When she offered them water, a basic courtesy in her office, one of the men picked up the glass and stared at it as if he'd never seen such an object before, holding it but never drinking. The visit lasted perhaps 20 minutes, during which the men asked questions that became increasingly bizarre. They wanted to know if she'd experienced any unusual dreams, whether her electrical devices had malfunctioned, if she'd received any strange phone calls. The questions felt less like investigation and more like evaluation, as if they were testing her responses rather than seeking information. When Heyer asked to examine their identification more carefully, the men became agitated. Their movements, which had been unnaturally smooth, became jerky and uncertain. They stood abruptly, stated that they had the information they needed, and left. She watched through her office window as they climbed into a black sedan with darkly tinted windows and no visible license plates. Connie Carpenter, the young woman who had encountered the Mothman on the road near her home, received a visit that was even more disturbing. Two men arrived at her door late one evening after dark. They wore black suits that seemed outdated in style, cut in a way that suggested the 1940s or 50s, rather than the contemporary 1960s. They wore dark glasses despite the nighttime hour. Their faces were pale to the point of appearing bloodless. They identified themselves as Air Force investigators looking into unusual phenomena reports. They asked her to describe her encounter in exhaustive detail, wanting to know not just what she'd seen, but what she'd felt, what she'd thought, whether she'd experienced any physical symptoms afterward. They asked if she'd told many people about the encounter, whether she planned to speak to media again, whether she believed what she'd seen was real. The questions became stranger. They asked about her family history, her medical background, whether she'd ever experienced missing time or unexplained gaps in her memory, whether she believed in life on other planets. The conversation felt less like an official investigation and more like an interrogation designed to determine something about her personally. When Carpenter's husband returned home unexpectedly and entered the room, the men's demeanour changed dramatically. They became visibly uncomfortable, their previously formal composure cracking. They moved toward the door with hurried, awkward movements. One of them stumbled slightly, as if unfamiliar with the basic act of walking. They left abruptly, climbing into a dark vehicle that drove away with unusual speed. Carpenter and her husband immediately noted strange details about the visit. The men had left no business cards. The vehicle had no visible plates or identification. The Air Force identification they'd shown hadn't included names, just badge numbers that seemed too long, 8 or 9 digits rather than the standard format. And most disturbingly, when Carpenter later contacted the Air Force base nearest to Point Pleasant to verify that investigators had been sent to interview her, the base had no record of any such visit. The pattern of these visits became clear as more witnesses came forward. The visitors always came in pairs or groups of 3. They always wore dark suits, black or very dark grey, that were either brand new or somehow maintained in pristine condition, despite the muddy roads and winter weather of rural West Virginia. They wore dark glasses even at night or indoors. They drove dark sedans with tinted windows, but the most consistent element was their behaviour. Every witness who received such a visit described the same fundamental wrongness in how these men acted. They spoke in formal, stilted language that sounded like it came from a script. They moved in ways that seemed slightly off, too smooth or too jerky, but never quite natural. They seemed confused by ordinary objects or social conventions. They asked questions that started as reasonable investigation but veered into bizarre territory. Some witnesses reported that the men seemed to know things they shouldn't, details about private conversations, information about other witnesses that hadn't been made public, specific descriptions of sightings that matched the witness's experience but that the witness hadn't shared with anyone. This suggested either remarkable intelligence gathering or something more unsettling, precognitive knowledge or surveillance capabilities that exceeded anything normal investigators would possess. The vehicles these men drove were consistently described in similar terms: brand new American-made sedans, usually Cadillacs or Lincolns, in black or very dark colours. Windows tinted far darker than was standard or legal. Immaculately maintained, without mud or road dust despite driving on the unpaved roads around Point Pleasant. No visible license plates, or plates that witnesses couldn't quite focus on or remember afterward. Several people reported seeing these vehicles driving slowly through town at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, moving at crawling speeds through residential neighbourhoods, as if the occupants were looking for something. The vehicles would sometimes park near a witness's home for extended periods, just sitting there with engines idling, then drive away when approached or when someone called police. John Keel encountered these figures repeatedly during his investigation. He was followed constantly, dark vehicles appearing in his rearview mirror on country roads, maintaining precise distance behind him. He received visits at his accommodation, always late at night, from men who asked questions about his investigation in that same unsettling, artificial manner. One visit particularly disturbed him. 2 men arrived at his door after midnight. They were dressed in the standard dark suits, with dark glasses worn despite the late hour. They asked to come in, and Keel, curious about the phenomenon and confident in his ability to handle most situations, allowed them entry. The men sat in chairs in his room and proceeded to ask questions about his research. But their questions revealed knowledge they shouldn't possess. They referenced interviews Keel had conducted that day, interviews that hadn't been publicised or discussed with anyone. They mentioned conversations Keel had had on the telephone with colleagues in other states. They asked about his theories regarding the Mothman with specificity that suggested they'd read his private notes. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Throughout, Keel noticed the same elements other witnesses had reported. The men didn't blink normally. Their eyes would remain open for unsettling periods, then they would blink several times in rapid succession. Their skin had an odd pallor, almost greyish. Their movements were stiff and precise, as if they were consciously controlling each gesture rather than moving naturally. When Keel asked direct questions about their identity and authority, they provided answers that sounded plausible but were deliberately vague. Government investigators, they said, looking into unusual phenomena that might have national security implications. They couldn't provide specific agency names for reasons of classification. They showed identification that looked authentic but that Keel couldn't examine closely. They held it briefly, and then returned it to Pockets before he could note details. Then they delivered what seemed like a warning. They told Keel that his investigation was attracting unwanted attention, that he should consider whether the information he was gathering was worth the personal cost of continuing, that some questions were better left unasked. The words were carefully chosen, never quite crossing into overt threat, but the implication was clear. After they left, Keel examined his room carefully. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but he had the distinct impression that the visit had been as much about establishing surveillance presence as about delivering any message. He felt watched constantly from that point forward. The identity and purpose of these mysterious visitors became one of the enduring mysteries of the Mothman case. The term Men in Black had been used in UFO circles for years to describe similar encounters, mysterious figures in dark suits who visited UFO witnesses and warned them not to discuss what they'd seen. The phenomenon had been reported across the country, dating back to the early 1950s. Several theories emerged to explain the Men in Black. Some researchers believed they were government agents, perhaps from military intelligence or classified research programs, monitoring phenomena that had national security implications. The awkward behaviour and unusual questioning could be explained as poor field training or deliberate intimidation tactics designed to discredit witnesses by association with crazy conspiracy theories. But this explanation had problems. The level of knowledge the visitors displayed, private conversations, unpublicised details, suggested either surveillance capabilities far beyond what was reasonable for low-priority investigations, or access to information through methods that didn't fit standard intelligence gathering. The vehicles with no plates violated basic operational security that any real government agent would maintain. And most significantly, when witnesses tried to verify these visits with official agencies, they found no record of any such investigations. Keel developed a different theory. He came to believe that the Men in Black were not human agents, but were part of the same phenomenon that manifested as the Mothman. They were projections or constructs, entities that appeared human but couldn't quite maintain the performance. They were intelligence operating from outside normal reality, attempting to interact with humans but lacking perfect understanding of how humans actually behaved. This would explain the stilted language, beings who understood the mechanics of human speech but not the subtleties. The awkward movements, entities controlling physical forms but not perfectly. The knowledge of private information, beings that existed in states where time or consciousness operated differently, giving them access to information through means that weren't physical surveillance. It would also explain why the visit served no obvious practical purpose. If the goal was genuinely to suppress information, The methods were counterproductive. The visits themselves became part of the mystery, adding to rather than reducing public interest. But if the goal was simply to interact, to study human reactions, to be present during significant events, then the visits made more sense as observation than intervention. The Men in Black phenomenon added a layer of paranoia and uncertainty to the already strange events in Point Pleasant. Witnesses who might have continued discussing their experiences publicly became reluctant to do so after receiving such visits. The sense that something larger was happening, that the Mothman sightings were part of a broader pattern of high strangeness, deepened among both witnesses and investigators, and the visits continued throughout the winter and into spring of 1967, maintaining a steady presence alongside the creature sightings. Whatever was happening in Point Pleasant had attracted attention from entities or agencies that operated outside normal channels of authority and understanding. The question of what the Men in Black actually were remains debated to this day. Government agents, extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional entities, psychological projections somehow given temporary physical form, or something else entirely, something that defies our categories and exists in spaces our science hasn't yet learned to map. But for the witnesses who encountered them, the truth was simpler and more frightening. Something that looked almost human but wasn't quite right had come to their doors and asked questions in the middle of the night, and whatever these visitors were, they were connected to the creature with wings and glowing red eyes that was haunting their town. Chapter 6. The Prophecy Angle. As 1967 progressed and the Mothman sightings continued with disturbing regularity, a pattern emerged that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Witnesses weren't just seeing the creature, they were experiencing precognitive phenomena, dreams of future events, intuitions that proved accurate, warnings delivered through unexplained means that seemed to predict disasters before they occurred. These reports were difficult to categorize and even more difficult to investigate properly. Precognition challenges fundamental assumptions about causality and time. Most scientists dismiss such reports as confirmation bias. People have hundreds of dreams and intuitions, and when one happens to align with a future event, they remember that one and forget the hundreds of false predictions. But in Point Pleasant during 1967, the volume and specificity of precognitive reports exceeded what random chance would predict. One woman, a housewife with no history of psychic claims or unusual experiences, reported a disturbing dream in early December of 1966. She dreamed of dark water and Christmas tragedy. She saw twisted metal and heard screaming. She saw emergency lights reflected in dark river water. The dream recurred several times over the following weeks, each time with the same basic imagery, but increasing emotional intensity. She mentioned the dream to her family and close friends, though she had no context for what it might mean. Point Pleasant was a peaceful town. There was no obvious source of Christmas tragedy, but the dream disturbed her enough that she documented it in her personal journal, noting the dates of each recurrence and the specific images that appeared. 3 weeks later, the Silver Bridge would collapse during Christmas shopping season, sending vehicles into the dark waters of the Ohio River, while emergency lights illuminated the rescue efforts. Another witness, a factory worker who had seen the Mothman twice near the TNT area, reported receiving a strange phone call in mid-November of 1967. The caller's voice was distorted and mechanical, as if generated by primitive text-to-speech technology. The message was cryptic but disturbing. December will bring change. Many will be affected. The bridge. The worker tried to ask for clarification, but the line went dead. He mentioned the call to co-workers but didn't report it to authorities. It seemed too vague to constitute a threat, and he assumed it was a prank related to the Mothman publicity. But after the bridge collapse, he contacted John Keel and described the call in detail, providing specific dates and times that Keel was able to verify through phone records. Mary Heyer, the journalist, documented dozens of similar accounts as part of her comprehensive reporting on the Mothman phenomenon. People reporting feelings of dread that intensified as the year progressed, intuitions that something significant and terrible was approaching, dreams featuring dark water, falling, twisted metal, and overwhelming sadness. Some of these reports came from people who had never had Mothman sightings, suggesting that whatever was causing the precognitive experiences was broader than direct encounters with the creature. But many came from witnesses who had seen the Mothman, and these witnesses often described feeling that the creature itself was somehow connected to their premonitions. Several people reported experiencing mental impressions during Mothman encounters. Not words or language, but emotional or conceptual communication that bypassed verbal thought. One witness described it as feeling the creature's purpose without understanding it, like knowing someone is trying to tell you something important, but speaking a language you don't know. Another witness, a teenager who had seen the creature perched on a power line near his home, described the experience in even more specific terms. When it looked at me, I felt overwhelmed with this sense of wrongness. Not that the creature was wrong, but that something was wrong. Like reality itself was off balance and about to tip over. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't, but I knew something bad was coming. These descriptions suggested that the Mothman might be attempting communication through means other than language or gesture, that its appearances were deliberate attempts to create awareness of approaching danger. But without a shared method of communication, the warnings remained vague and uninterpretable until after the fact. Keel was fascinated and disturbed by these reports. As a journalist with a background in skeptical investigation, he found precognition philosophically problematic. If future events could be known before they occurred, it challenged basic assumptions about causality and free will. But the volume of reports and the specificity of some predictions exceeded what he could comfortably dismiss as coincidence or post-event rationalization. He began keeping a separate file of prophecy-related accounts, documenting each report with careful attention to dates and details. He noted when predictions were made, what specific information they contained, and whether they were later verified. He tried to remain objective, acknowledging that most precognitive claims would prove false or too vague to verify, but documenting everything thoroughly enough that any genuine pattern would be visible. What emerged from his analysis was troubling. The frequency of precognitive experiences had increased dramatically since the Mothman sightings began. People who had never previously claimed psychic abilities were having vivid prophetic dreams. The content of these experiences clustered around specific themes: water, bridges, falling, December, emergency lights, tragedy during holiday celebrations. Keel also noticed an increase in reported UFO activity over the Ohio River Valley during the same period. Witnesses described unusual lights moving in patterns that didn't match conventional aircraft. Objects hovering silently over the water, bright flashes that illuminated the entire sky for brief moments. Some of these reports came from the same witnesses who were having precognitive experiences, suggesting a possible connection between all the phenomena. He began to theorize that something was happening in Point Pleasant that went beyond simple creature sightings, that the town was experiencing a window period, his term for times and places where barriers between normal reality and whatever lay beyond became permeable. During window periods, multiple types of high strangeness manifested simultaneously: UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, poltergeist activity, precognitive experiences, and encounters with entities like the Men in Black. The Mothman, in this framework, wasn't causing the other phenomena. It was one manifestation among many of whatever underlying process was occurring, and that process was somehow connected to approaching tragedy, either drawing energy from the future event or existing in a state where the future was already visible and trying to communicate warnings backward through time. This interpretation suggested that the Mothman wasn't a creature in any biological sense. It was more like a symptom or a sign, a way that approaching disaster made itself visible to those sensitive enough to perceive it. The glowing red eyes weren't just physical features but symbolic representations of warning. The massive wings weren't for flight but for visibility, making the messenger large enough and strange enough to be impossible to ignore. But warnings from entities that exist outside human linguistic and temporal frameworks are nearly impossible to interpret correctly. The Mothman appeared. People saw it. They felt disturbed and alerted. They knew something was wrong, but without clear context they couldn't, next, determine what specifically was approaching or how to prevent it. In hindsight, many witnesses would report that they'd felt the Mothman was trying to warn them about something, that the creature's persistence, appearing night after night, location after location, to witness after witness, was deliberate communication rather than random activity. That if they'd been able to properly interpret what they were seeing and feeling, they might have understood that the bridge was dangerous, that December 15th was going to bring tragedy, that 46 people would die if nobody acted. But prophecy without clear translation is just anxiety, and by late 1967, as winter approached and the anniversary of the first sighting drew near, that anxiety was building toward a breaking point. Something terrible was coming. The Mothman had been trying to warn them for 13 months, and time was running out. Chapter 7. The Silver Bridge Collapse. December 15th, 1967. Friday afternoon, the week before Christmas. Point Pleasant was busy with holiday shoppers and workers finishing their shifts before the weekend. The downtown stores were decorated for the season. Families were finalising plans for Christmas celebrations. The mood in town was festive despite the undercurrent of unease from 13 months of Mothman sightings. The Silver Bridge stood as it had for nearly 40 years, a suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, across the Ohio River. The structure was an engineering marvel of its era, built in 1928 using an innovative I-bar chain design. Instead of cables supporting the roadway, massive steel bars linked together like a giant chain bore the weight of the bridge and everything crossing it. Route 17, a major regional highway, crossed the Ohio River via the Silver Bridge. The structure carried an average of 4,000 vehicles per day, serving as the primary connection between the two states for dozens of miles in either direction. For residents on both sides of the river, the bridge was essential infrastructure they used constantly without thinking about it. That Friday afternoon, the bridge was packed with traffic. Rush hour combined with holiday shopping created bumper-to-bumper conditions across the entire span. Cars idled in both directions, their engines running, exhaust visible in the cold December air. On the bridge's pedestrian walkway, people made their way across on foot, some carrying shopping bags, others just crossing to reach destinations on the opposite shore. The weather was cold but clear, temperature in the low 30s, no rain, no ice, no obvious conditions that would stress the structure. Just typical December weather in West Virginia, and typical Friday afternoon traffic on a vital piece of infrastructure. At approximately 5:04 in the afternoon, something failed. An I-bar in the suspension chain, a single piece of steel roughly 55 feet long, fractured completely. The metal had been weakened by decades of stress and by a microscopic flaw that had existed since the bar was manufactured in the 1920s. The defect was invisible to inspection, hidden within the solid steel, growing slowly over nearly 40 years until it reached critical failure point. When the I-bar broke, it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The load previously carried by that single bar redistributed to adjacent bars, overloading them instantly. Those bars failed within seconds. The suspension chain separated, releasing one side of the roadway from its support. The bridge didn't collapse slowly. There was no gradual sagging that would have given drivers time to stop or pedestrians time to run. The roadway dropped from beneath vehicles in sudden, violent motion. The entire structure twisted and fell apart in approximately 1 minute from initial failure to complete collapse. Witness accounts from shore described a scene of unimaginable horror. The bridge roadway broke into sections, each piece falling toward the river at different angles. Vehicles toppled into the water, some falling straight down, others sliding as sections tilted before breaking completely. The sound was overwhelming. Screaming metal, breaking concrete, car horns, engines revving uselessly, and human voices crying out in terror and confusion. 75 vehicles were on the bridge when it collapsed. More than 100 people, drivers and passengers were on the structure. The river below was the Ohio in winter, cold enough that survival time in the water was measured in minutes. The current was strong enough to sweep wreckage and victims downstream. The impact of vehicles hitting water from significant height was often immediately fatal. Emergency responders arrived within minutes to find chaos beyond anything they'd trained for. Point Pleasant was a small town with limited emergency services. The scale of disaster overwhelmed available resources immediately. Rescue boats launched into the freezing river, searching for survivors among the wreckage. Divers prepared to search submerged vehicles. Medical personnel set up triage areas on both shores. Some people survived the initial collapse through chance or position. Vehicles near the edges of the bridge landed on partially collapsed sections of roadway, rather than in deep water. Some drivers were able to escape their vehicles and swim to shore before hypothermia set in. Others were pulled from the water by quick-thinking rescuers who launched private boats before official emergency services arrived. But many others didn't survive. Vehicles trapped underwater with occupants unable to escape before the cold water induced unconsciousness. Bodies swept downstream by the current. Some recovered quickly, others not found for days or weeks. Impact trauma from the fall that killed instantly. Hypothermia that claimed victims who survived the initial impact but couldn't reach shore before the cold water stopped their hearts. The final death toll was 46 people. 18 vehicles remained submerged in the river for extended periods, requiring specialised recovery operations. Some bodies weren't recovered for weeks. The youngest victim was an infant. The oldest were elderly couples who had been crossing the bridge to reach Christmas shopping destinations. Point Pleasant, with a population of barely 5,000, went into shock. Nearly every family in town knew someone who had died or been injured. The scale of loss was devastating. Christmas celebrations were cancelled. Churches filled with grieving families. The small town newspaper struggled to document the scope of tragedy while dealing with its own grief. Several staff members had lost relatives in the collapse. Emergency declarations brought state and federal resources to assist with rescue and recovery operations. The National Transportation Safety Board dispatched investigators to determine the cause of collapse. Engineering teams arrived to examine the wreckage and understand exactly what had failed and why. Media from around the country descended on Point Pleasant, documenting both the tragedy and the recovery efforts, and the Mothman sightings stopped. Almost immediately after the disaster, the reports ceased. The creature that had been seen regularly for 13 months simply vanished. The TNT area returned to quiet abandonment. The strange phone calls ended. The men in black departed or stopped making themselves visible. Whatever had been present in Point Pleasant was gone. The correlation was impossible to ignore. For 13 months the creature had appeared with disturbing regularity, creating a pattern of high strangeness that had put the town on edge. Dozens of witnesses had reported encounters. Hundreds more had heard the reports and felt increasing unease. Then tragedy struck, swift, sudden, and devastating. And the phenomenon ended precisely when the disaster occurred. Was it coincidence? Or was there a connection that challenged everything witnesses thought they understood about reality, causality, and time? Chapter 8. Coincidence or correlation? In the immediate aftermath of the Silver Bridge collapse, investigators and engineers focused on determining the physical cause of failure. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted an exhaustive examination of the wreckage, recovering key structural components from the river and analysing them in detail. Their findings were conclusive and disturbing. The collapse resulted from the catastrophic failure of a single eye bar in one of the suspension chains. The bar contained a microscopic defect, a tiny crack that had existed since the steel was manufactured in the 1920s. Over 40 years of constant stress, the defect had grown slowly, weakening the bar until it reached the point where it could no longer support the load. The defect was located in a position that made inspection nearly impossible. Visual examination wouldn't have revealed it. Standard inspection procedures of the era weren't designed to detect this type of internal flaw. The bridge had been inspected regularly and considered safe based on all available information and standard engineering practices. But in hindsight, warning signs had existed. The eye-bar design itself was known by the 1960s to have limitations. It created single points of failure where a single component breaking could trigger catastrophic collapse. Newer bridges used cable suspension systems with redundancy built in. Several engineers had suggested the bridge should be replaced with modern design. but budget constraints and the expense of such a project had delayed action. The collapse was preventable in the sense that if the defective eye-bar had been identified and replaced, the tragedy wouldn't have occurred. But with the technology and inspection protocols available at the time, there was no realistic way to have discovered the flaw before failure. The official explanation was thorough, scientifically sound, and based on physical evidence that could be examined and verified. It satisfied engineering requirements for understanding what had happened and preventing future similar failures. Modern inspection protocols and bridge design standards were updated based on lessons learned from the Point Pleasant disaster. But that explanation, while factually accurate regarding the immediate physical cause, didn't address the larger questions that haunted witnesses and investigators. Why had the Mothman appeared exactly 13 months before the collapse? Why had precognitive dreams and warnings increased in frequency as the disaster approached? Why had the sightings focused on Point Pleasant, rather than any other location with an aging bridge? Why had the phenomenon ended the moment the disaster occurred? The skeptical position was straightforward and logical. The bridge was deteriorating for decades. Its failure was inevitable given the hidden defect and the increasing traffic loads. The Mothman was either misidentification of ordinary animals, perhaps sandhill cranes or large owls, or a combination of mass hysteria, media amplification, and a few genuine hoaxes. The timing was pure coincidence. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures who see connections where none exist, especially in the wake of tragedy. The precognitive dreams were either fabricated after the fact or were the statistically inevitable result of many people having many dreams, some of which would randomly align with future events. This explanation had the advantage of requiring no violation of known physical laws. It demanded no supernatural forces or unexplained phenomena. It fit comfortably within materialist worldview and conventional understanding of reality. For many people, it was and remains the only acceptable interpretation. But this explanation had significant problems that bothered even some skeptics. First, the consistency and volume of witness descriptions. Over 100 people from diverse backgrounds reported seeing essentially the same thing. Grey humanoid figure, 6 to 7 feet tall, massive wings spanning 10 or more feet, large glowing red eyes. These witnesses included police officers, veterans, business owners, factory workers, housewives, people with varying levels of education and credibility, but united in describing experiences that terrified them. Misidentification of known animals couldn't easily account for such consistency across independent reports. Sandhill cranes, the most commonly proposed explanation, do have red patches on their heads and impressive wingspans of up to 7 feet. They migrate through the region, but they don't reach 7 feet in height. They can't fly at 70 miles per hour for extended distances. Their eyes don't glow red at night. The red patches are on their heads, not their eyes. They don't hover in place or vanish instantaneously. They're shy birds that avoid human contact rather than repeatedly appearing near populated areas. Second, the temporal pattern. The sightings began in November of 1966 and ended in December of 1967. A 13-month window that aligned precisely with the period before the collapse. The start date wasn't gradual. The phenomenon emerged suddenly with the Scarberry-Mallet encounter and immediately became frequent and consistent. The end date was similarly abrupt. The creature appeared regularly until the bridge fell, then disappeared completely. If the phenomenon was random animal sightings misidentified due to hysteria, why would it start and stop so cleanly? Why would it maintain consistent patterns for exactly 13 months? Third, the precognitive elements. Multiple witnesses reported dreams and premonitions of disaster before the collapse occurred, and crucially, several of these were documented before the tragedy. The housewife's journal entries describing dreams of dark water and Christmas tragedy. The factory worker's phone call mentioning December, change, and bridges. Mary Hyer's documentation of multiple witnesses reporting increasing feelings of dread and specific imagery that later matched the actual disaster. These weren't retrofitted memories, they were recorded predictions that proved accurate. Statistical analysis of precognitive claims is complex, but the volume and specificity of correct predictions in Point Pleasant during 1967 exceeded baseline expectations significantly. Even accounting for false memories, selective reporting, and the tendency to remember hits and forget misses, the pattern was remarkable enough to warrant serious consideration. Fourth, the behaviour of the phenomenon. If the Mothman was simply a misidentified animal or a series of hoaxes, certain behavioural elements made no sense. The creature never attacked anyone despite dozens of close encounters. It appeared in ways that maximised witness observation rather than avoiding detection. It returned to the same general area repeatedly rather than moving on as an actual animal would. It displayed flight capabilities that exceeded known species. It appeared to multiple independent witnesses on the same nights in locations that would require impossibly rapid travel between sightings. These behavioural patterns suggested either an intelligent entity deliberately staging encounters, or something that wasn't constrained by the physical limitations that would govern a biological creature. John Keel's interpretation evolved throughout his investigation and his subsequent analysis. By the time he published the Mothman Prophecies in 1975, he had developed a comprehensive theory that attempted to account for all aspects of the phenomenon rather than just the creature sightings. Keel proposed that the Mothman was not a biological cryptid, but a manifestation of intelligence operating outside normal physical constraints. He used the term ultra-terrestrial to describe entities that existed in dimensions or states parallel to our own and occasionally intersected with human reality. These weren't extraterrestrial visitors from other planets, but rather intelligences that existed alongside humanity in spaces or dimensions that normal human perception couldn't access. In Keel's framework, the bridge collapse was an event of such magnitude that it created ripples through whatever dimensional space these intelligences inhabited. The disaster was visible to them before it occurred in human linear time, either because they existed in states where time functioned differently, or because major events created temporal distortions that extended both forward and backward. The Mothman appeared because it was drawn to the location by the approaching tragedy. It manifested in a form that would be memorable and disturbing to human witnesses: wings for visibility, red eyes for symbolism, humanoid shape for partial comprehensibility. It appeared repeatedly because it was attempting to create awareness, to warn in the only way available to an intelligence that couldn't speak human language or manipulate human reality directly. But warnings from entities that exist outside human linguistic and conceptual frameworks are nearly impossible to interpret correctly. The Mothman showed itself. People saw it. They talked about it. They became alert and uneasy. But without clear communication, the message remained ambiguous until after the tragedy occurred, and context made everything clear in retrospect. This interpretation was controversial and remains debated. It required accepting the existence of intelligence beyond what science had documented. It challenged materialist understanding of reality by proposing dimensions or states of being that couldn't be measured with current technology. It suggested that time might not function as straightforwardly as human experience suggests, that future events might somehow affect past moments in ways that violated conventional causality. Skeptics found this framework unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. If physical evidence for the Mothman could be explained away as manifestation from another dimension, then the theory could never be disproven. It became essentially a religious or philosophical position rather than a scientific hypothesis. But Keel wasn't attempting to produce a falsifiable scientific theory. He was attempting to create a framework that accounted for all reported phenomena, not just the creature sightings but the men in black encounters, the precognitive dreams, the electrical disturbances, the strange phone calls, the sense of intelligence and purpose behind everything that happened. No single explanation from conventional science and materialism could encompass all these elements coherently. Other researchers proposed alternative theories. Some suggested government involvement, that the Mothman was connected to secret experiments at the TNT area, perhaps involving psychoactive chemicals or psychological warfare research. The men in black could be genuine government agents monitoring the situation. The prophecies could be the result of subconscious detection of real warning signs, people noticing structural problems with the bridge or behavioural changes in animals that signalled approaching disaster. This explanation had the advantage of requiring only expanded government secrecy rather than violation of physical laws, but it struggled to account for the specific behavioural patterns of the Mothman and the Men in Black. It didn't explain why such experiments would be conducted in ways guaranteed to attract massive public attention. It didn't address the correlation between the phenomenon and the disaster. Some paranormal researchers suggested psychic or consciousness-based explanations. Perhaps the Mothman was a collective thought form, an entity created by human fear and expectation, given temporary reality by the focused attention of thousands of people. Perhaps the approaching disaster created psychological disturbances that manifested as visions and experiences. Perhaps certain individuals were genuinely psychic, and their precognitive abilities were triggered by the proximity of tragedy. These theories struggled with the physical aspects of the phenomenon, the multiple witness sightings, the documented pursuit of vehicles, the consistency of descriptions across witnesses who had no contact with each other. What remained undeniable, regardless of interpretation, was the pattern. Something extraordinary happened in Point Pleasant between November of 1966 and December of 1967. Whether that something was biological, interdimensional, psychological, or technological, it left a permanent mark on everyone who witnessed it, and 46 people died in a disaster that may or may not have been connected to 13 months of impossible encounters. The Silver Bridge was never rebuilt at its original location. A new bridge was constructed downstream, modern in design with multiple redundancies built in. The original site remains empty, a gap in the river crossing where 100 people crossed on a December afternoon and 46 never returned. In the decades since, engineers and investigators have occasionally re-examined the bridge collapse, applying new analytical techniques and inspection technologies to understand exactly what happened. The core conclusion remains unchanged: a microscopic defect in a single eye bar, impossible to detect with available technology, that finally failed after 40 years of stress. But that explanation, accurate as it is regarding immediate physical causality, still doesn't address the deeper mystery. Why did something impossible appear in Point Pleasant for 13 months before the tragedy? What was it trying to communicate? And if it was genuinely attempting to warn the town, why couldn't that warning be understood until after 46 people had died? Those questions remain unanswered, and they continue to haunt everyone who examines the Mothman case with genuine attention to all available evidence rather than dismissing what doesn't fit comfortable explanations. Chapter 9. Not a creature, but a phenomenon. John Keel's final analysis of the Mothman events, developed over years of reflection following the bridge collapse, represented a fundamental shift in how cryptid sightings and related phenomena might be understood. He wasn't just investigating a strange creature anymore. He was documenting something that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Keel had spent years before Point Pleasant investigating UFOs and paranormal phenomena across the United States. He had interviewed thousands of witnesses, documented hundreds of cases, and accumulated a massive archive of reports that shared common elements despite occurring in different locations and time periods. He began to see patterns that suggested these apparently separate phenomena: UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, poltergeist activity, Men in Black visits, precognitive experiences were not distinct categories but different manifestations of the same underlying process. He called this underlying process ultra-terrestrial activity, and he dedicated much of his later work to developing a comprehensive theory that could account for the full spectrum of high strangeness that appeared in certain locations during certain time periods. The Mothman, in Keel's analysis, was not a biological entity. It was a temporary manifestation of intelligence that existed outside conventional reality. It took a form that would be memorable and disturbing to human witnesses, but not entirely incomprehensible. Wings, because humans understand birds, and flight. Red eyes, because they convey intelligence, awareness, and warning. A humanoid shape, because pure alien form would be too foreign for human minds to process and remember. This projection theory explains several puzzling aspects of the sightings that biological explanations struggled with. Why the creature left no physical evidence, no footprints, no droppings, no shed material, nothing that would confirm it was a flesh and blood animal. Why it could appear and disappear instantaneously rather than flying away visibly. Why it seemed to defy aerodynamics and physics in its movement, hovering without visible effort, matching car speeds that should require enormous energy expenditure, disappearing mid-flight. It also explained the prophecy angle. If the Mothman existed in a state where linear time functioned differently, or where major future events were somehow visible before they occurred in normal human time, then its appearances were attempts to create awareness of approaching disaster using the only method available. It couldn't speak human language, it couldn't write warnings or make phone calls with clear messages, but it could manifest in a form that would be seen, discussed and remembered. It could create a pattern of high strangeness that would put the community on alert and make people more observant and cautious. Keel noted that the Mothman never attacked anyone despite numerous close encounters. This suggested either benevolent intent or simply lack of interest in causing direct harm. The creature's goal appeared to be communication rather than predation. It wanted witnesses. It needed people to see it, to talk about it, to create a comprehensive record of its presence. The repeated appearances at similar locations, the willingness to be photographed, even if photographs didn't capture clear images, the tendency to appear to multiple witnesses rather than isolated individuals, all suggested deliberate visibility rather than animal behaviour. The form the Mothman chose had precedent in folklore and religious imagery across cultures. Winged humanoids appeared in ancient texts and modern reports worldwide. Angels and demons in Judeo-Christian tradition, gargoyles in European architecture, thunderbirds in Native American lore, Tengu in Japanese folklore. The archetype of the winged messenger or harbinger existed in human consciousness long before Point Pleasant. Perhaps, Keel suggested, the phenomenon drew on these existing templates when manifesting in ways humans could perceive. It accessed the collective unconscious or cultural memory and produced a form that carried symbolic weight, a messenger with wings, a harbinger with burning eyes, not because it actually had those physical features, but because projecting that appearance created the desired psychological and cultural response in witnesses. This interpretation moved the Mothman out of cryptozoology entirely. It was no longer a question of what species the creature might be or where it lived when not being observed. It was instead a question of what type of intelligence could project itself into human perceptible form, what dimensional or consciousness-based space such intelligence inhabited, and what it was trying to achieve through manifestation. Keel connected the Mothman phenomenon to UFO sightings through similar principles. Many UFO encounters involved craft that seemed to violate physics, making right-angle turns at high speed, hovering silently, disappearing instantaneously. Witnesses often reported time distortions, telepathic communication, and physical effects similar to what Mothman witnesses described. Some UFO encounters included humanoid entities that seemed slightly wrong, too perfect, too strange, not quite convincing as biological beings. Keel proposed that both phenomena were manifestations of ultra-terrestrial intelligence, entities that existed in states parallel to human reality and occasionally intersected with our dimensional space. UFOs might not be physical craft from other planets, but rather projections designed to be visible to humans. The entities associated with them might not be extraterrestrial biological entities, but rather constructs or avatars created for temporary interaction. This framework was controversial and remains highly debated. It required accepting several propositions that mainstream science found difficult to evaluate. That consciousness or intelligence could exist independent of biological substrate. That dimensions or states of being beyond the three spatial dimensions and one time dimension humans experience directly might exist and be inhabited. That entities in such spaces might be able to project manifestations into human perceptible reality without being fully present in conventional physical terms. The theory was also frustratingly vague in specifics. What exactly were these other dimensions? How did projection from them into human reality work mechanically? What were the rules and limitations? Why would such intelligences bother manifesting to humans at all? Keel provided frameworks and speculation, but couldn't offer concrete mechanisms or testable predictions. Skeptics noted that the theory could explain anything, and therefore explained nothing. Any lack of physical evidence supported the projection theory. Any strange behaviour confirmed non-physical origin. The framework was essentially unfalsifiable. There was no observation or evidence that could disprove it. This made it interesting philosophy or speculative metaphysics, but not science in the conventional sense. Keel acknowledged these limitations, but argued that conventional science was simply inadequate for addressing the full spectrum of reported phenomena. If you limited investigation only to questions that could be resolved with materialist assumptions and current technology, you would never be able to account for the full range of human experience. Sometimes, he suggested, you had to develop new frameworks even if they couldn't be immediately verified, because the old frameworks demonstrably failed to account for documented observations. The Mothman, in Keel's final analysis, was a messenger. Not a biological creature waiting to be captured and studied, but a temporary manifestation of something vast and strange that occasionally makes itself known to humans. It appeared because something significant was approaching, a disaster visible to entities that existed in states where time functioned differently than human linear experience. It persisted because the message wasn't being understood. It vanished because the event it was signalling had finally occurred, and there was no longer any reason to maintain the warning. Whether this interpretation is correct remains unknowable with current understanding and technology, but it offers a framework that respects witness testimony, acknowledges the strangeness without dismissing it, and admits that reality might be far more complex than materialist science currently allows. It treats the Mothman not as a hoax or delusion or misidentification, but as genuine phenomenon that reveals the limitations of current scientific paradigms. And it leaves open the possibility that the Mothman might appear again. That if another disaster of sufficient magnitude approached, another community might experience 13 months of impossible sightings. That somewhere, in dimensional spaces humans can't directly access, intelligence exists that occasionally tries to warn us when tragedy approaches, using the only methods available to beings that exist outside our conventional reality. The messenger might take different forms in different cultural contexts. It might appear as wings and red eyes in West Virginia, as luminous spheres in other locations, as beings of light or shadow, as voices without source, or visions without physical cause. But the purpose would remain the same: to create awareness, to signal approaching disaster, to warn in whatever way entities outside normal time and space can warn those trapped within it. Whether any human can properly interpret such warnings remains an open question. But Point Pleasant suggests that at minimum, the attempt is made. That something tried to warn the town for 13 months. That 46 people died anyway, not because the warning was absent, but because it couldn't be translated into actionable information until after the tragedy made its meaning clear. Chapter 10. Why Point Pleasant was chosen. The question of why Point Pleasant became the focal point for this phenomenon has occupied researchers, skeptics, and believers for more than 50 years. The town itself was unremarkable before the Mothman appeared, a small river community in West Virginia, economically dependent on manufacturing and river commerce, with nothing in its history suggesting it should become the centre of one of the most extensively documented paranormal events in American history. But location matters in ways that simple geography doesn't capture. Point Pleasant sits at a convergence point that might be significant from perspectives beyond conventional cartography. Geographically, Point Pleasant is positioned where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio River, a junction of two significant waterways creating a natural confluence. Water has held symbolic and supposedly actual significance in folklore and paranormal research across cultures. Rivers as boundaries between worlds, confluences as liminal spaces where normal rules become permeable, points where flowing water meets as locations of power or transition. This might be dismissed as superstition, but hydrological factors do create unusual local conditions. The meeting of two river systems affects magnetic fields slightly. Groundwater flows and limestone geology beneath the area create conditions for piezoelectric effects under stress. Some researchers have suggested that unusual geological or hydrological features create electromagnetic anomalies that could affect both human perception and potentially enable or attract unusual phenomena. The area's indigenous history added another layer. The Ohio River Valley had been inhabited for thousands of years before European settlement. The Shawnee, Cherokee and other nations considered portions of this territory significant, though specific details of their traditions regarding these locations were not well documented by the time white settlers arrived. Native American oral traditions from the broader region include references to winged beings, spirits of warning, and locations where boundaries between the physical and spirit worlds became thin. Some researchers noted possible connections between the Mothman and indigenous lore about thunderbirds or other winged entities associated with power and prophecy. Whether these connections are meaningful or represent superficial pattern, matching remains debated. The TNT area itself held recent dark history. Thousands of tons of high explosives manufactured there during World War II. Chemical contamination from wartime production that persisted decades later. Underground tunnel networks connecting bunkers and storage facilities. The accumulated psychic weight, if such things exist, of industrial-scale explosive production and the inherent danger that came with that work. Some theorists suggested that certain types of human activity, particularly activity related to death, war or large-scale destruction, might create conditions that attract or enable paranormal phenomena. That the psychic residue of manufacturing materials designed to kill might leave impressions on a location. Or more prosaically, that chemical contamination might affect human neurology in ways that increase susceptibility to unusual perceptual experiences. The timing was also potentially significant. The Mothman appeared during the mid-1960s, a period of intense social anxiety in America. The Cold War was at its peak. Nuclear annihilation felt like a genuine possibility. The Vietnam War was escalating and dividing the nation. The Kennedy assassination was recent history. Civil rights conflicts were intensifying. The counterculture movement was challenging traditional social structures. Some researchers propose that collective human consciousness during periods of intense stress might be more permeable to unusual phenomena. That when many people feel profound anxiety about catastrophe, they might become more sensitive to signals or warnings that normally go unnoticed, or that entities capable of manifesting in human perceptible forms might be drawn to locations where psychological stress creates favourable conditions for such manifestation. Others pointed to the infrastructure itself. The Silver Bridge was built in 1928, using a design that was, by the 1960s, outdated and known to have potential failure modes. The bridge was carrying far more traffic than it was originally designed for. Engineering studies conducted years before the collapse had noted concerns about the I-bar design's single points of failure. The approaching disaster was in some sense visible to anyone with engineering expertise examining the structure carefully. Perhaps some suggested the approaching catastrophe created conditions that allowed or attracted the phenomenon. That major disasters cast shadows backward through time in ways normal human perception doesn't detect, but that certain sensitive individuals or non-human intelligences might perceive. That the Mothman was drawn to Point Pleasant not because of anything special about the location, but because of the approaching tragedy, like moths drawn to flames, except drawn through time to disaster. John Keel suggested that the location mattered less than the event itself. The bridge collapse was the significant factor. The Mothman manifested wherever it needed to in order to create maximum awareness of approaching catastrophe. If the disaster had been scheduled to occur elsewhere, the phenomenon would have appeared there instead. But perhaps the simplest explanation, though simple doesn't mean correct, is that Point Pleasant was vulnerable in multiple ways that made it an ideal location for manifestation and documentation. A small town where strange reports would be taken seriously by local authorities but not immediately suppressed. A community tight-knit enough that information would spread quickly through social networks. A location remote enough to avoid constant outside scrutiny, but accessible enough that investigators like Keel could arrive and document events thoroughly. a place where witnesses would remember what they saw because they knew it was impossible, where law enforcement would file official reports rather than dismissing accounts, where journalists would document systematically rather than sensationalizing for entertainment, where the phenomenon could unfold over 13 months with enough visibility to ensure the story would be remembered and investigated for decades afterward. Whatever the reason, Point Pleasant became forever linked with the Mothman, the town that was visited by something impossible, the place where reality bent just enough for something else to slip through, the location where 100 witnesses saw a creature that shouldn't exist, and 46 people died in a tragedy that seemed impossible to separate from the 13 months of sightings that preceded it. The Silver Bridge collapse was a defining moment for Point Pleasant. The town lost part of its identity when those 46 people died, and the primary connection to Ohio was severed. Recovery took years. The new bridge downstream changed traffic patterns and commerce flows. The tragedy became the lens through which everything else in the town's history was viewed. But so did the Mothman. The creature sightings became inseparable from the bridge collapse in collective memory. The town embraced this eventually, transforming trauma and strangeness into identity and economic opportunity. The annual Mothman Festival draws thousands of visitors. The statue in the town centre has become an iconic image recognised internationally. Books, documentaries and films have told and retold the story, each version adding interpretation and emphasis. Yet beneath the commercialisation and cultural appropriation of the phenomenon, the genuine mystery remains. Something happened in Point Pleasant between November of 1966 and December of 1967 that no explanation fully captures. Witnesses saw something that terrified them. Precognitive warnings increased as tragedy approached. Tragedy struck with devastating force. The phenomenon ended when the disaster occurred. You can dismiss it as coincidence stacked upon misidentification amplified by media attention and crystallized by tragic disaster. You can accept it as genuine manifestation of interdimensional intelligence, attempting communication across barriers of language and time. You can position yourself anywhere along the spectrum between those poles, but the pattern remains and the questions remain. And Point Pleasant remains the town where the impossible refused to stay hidden, where something with wings and burning eyes appeared night after night for 13 months, and where 46 people died in a disaster that might have been foreseen but could not be prevented. Epilogue. The warning that remains. Today, the Ohio River flows past Point Pleasant just as it did on December the 15th, 1967. The current moves steadily, indifferent to the tragedy that occurred here, and indifferent to the 13 months of strangeness that preceded it. The water reflects sky and light, flowing as it has for millennia, connecting states and communities, serving as highway and boundary simultaneously. The new bridge stands downstream from where the Silver Bridge once connected Point Pleasant to Ohio. It's a modern structure, built with lessons learned from disaster and designed with redundancies that prevent single points of catastrophic failure. It carries Route 35 now, moved from the original Route 17 location. Traffic crosses constantly. Commuters, commercial trucks, tourists. Most drivers probably don't think about the engineering that keeps them suspended safely above the river. The bridge is reliable infrastructure, unremarkable in its competent function, but near the original site a small park preserves memory of what was lost. 46 names on a memorial, brief descriptions of who they were, the youngest, the oldest, the families travelling together who died together. The memorial is quiet, visited by relatives and by curious tourists who want to see where the tragedy occurred. The Ohio River flows past, relentless and unchanging, indifferent to human loss. In the centre of Point Pleasant stands another memorial, though this one commemorates something stranger than disaster. The Mothman statue rises on the corner of Main Street and 4th, a metallic figure with wings spread and muscular humanoid form, eyes gleaming red with internal illumination. It's become an iconic image, photographed constantly, appearing on countless websites and social media posts. The statue is art, tourism, commerce, mythology. It transforms trauma and mystery into something the town owns and controls. The annual Mothman Festival draws thousands of visitors each September. Vendors sell merchandise featuring the creature's distinctive silhouette. Authors present books analysing the sightings. Witnesses who are still alive occasionally appear to share their experiences. Researchers present theories. Skeptics present debunkings. The festival is celebration, investigation, and spectacle simultaneously. A strange hybrid of serious inquiry and commercial exploitation. The Mothman Museum documents the sightings with newspaper clippings, photographs, witness accounts, and artifacts from the era. It's a serious effort to preserve history, but it's also tourist attraction generating revenue. The dichotomy is uncomfortable. Genuine tragedy and mystery transformed into entertainment and economy. Yet perhaps this is how communities process trauma and strangeness, by incorporating the incomprehensible into daily life, by making the monster a mascot, by turning fear into something that can be controlled through representation and commerce. The witnesses who saw the Mothman carry their experiences privately now. Many have passed away. 60 years is a long time, and those who were adults in 1966 are elderly or gone now. Others remain but are reluctant to discuss what they encountered. The media attention was intense and often sceptical. Having your deepest fear dismissed as delusion or misidentification creates wounds that don't heal easily. Being associated with crazy conspiracy theories damages social standing and credibility. Some witnesses have participated in documentaries or written accounts of their experiences. Roger and Linda Scarberry, the couple whose November 15 encounter started the documented sightings, eventually shared their story multiple times. They never wavered from their account. They saw something impossible that night, something that terrified them so profoundly that 50 years later the memory remained vivid. Others chose silence. They know what they saw. They don't need external validation or explanation. They don't want the attention or the skepticism. They carry their encounter as private knowledge, occasionally mentioning it to trusted friends or family, but avoiding public discussion. John Keel continued investigating paranormal phenomena until his death in 2009. He wrote numerous books expanding his theories about ultra-terrestrial intelligence and the nature of reality. He never wavered from his interpretation of the Mothman events, that something intelligent and non-human manifested in Point Pleasant with purpose, that it tried to warn the town about approaching disaster, using the only methods available to entities that exist outside human linguistic and temporal frameworks. That it failed not through lack of effort, but because the message was impossible to translate into terms humans could act upon, until after tragedy made the meaning clear. Keel's work influenced generations of paranormal researchers and writers. His concept of ultra-terrestrials provided an alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis that dominated UFO research. His insistence on documenting high strangeness in all its manifestations, rather than focusing narrowly on craft sightings or creature encounters, created a more comprehensive approach to investigating the impossible. Critics argue that Keel's frameworks were unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific, that his theories could explain any observation and therefore had no predictive or explanatory power, that he had become too invested in his ideas to evaluate evidence objectively. These criticisms have merit from conventional scientific perspectives, but Keel's defense would be that conventional science was simply inadequate for addressing the phenomena he documented, that limiting investigation only to questions answerable within materialist frameworks guaranteed that the truly strange would remain permanently unexplained. The question that continues to haunt serious investigators isn't whether the Mothman was real. 100 witnesses, many of them credible and reluctant, reported essentially the same phenomenon. Multiple independent observers described the same creature on the same nights. Law enforcement documented sightings officially. Something was there. The question is what it was and why it appeared when and where it did. The bridge collapsed because of structural failure. That explanation is factually accurate and comprehensively documented. Engineering analysis proved exactly what failed and why. But that explanation doesn't account for the 13 months of sightings. It doesn't explain why the phenomenon ended when the disaster occurred. It doesn't address the precognitive dreams, the men in black, the electrical disturbances, the sense of purposeful intelligence behind the encounters. Perhaps warnings don't always arrive in forms humans can interpret. Perhaps there are messengers who operate outside human language and human time, attempting communication through the only methods available: visibility, persistence, the creation of patterns that should signal something wrong even if the specifics remain unclear. Perhaps the Mothman was exactly what witnesses described: a harbinger, a prophet, a messenger that appeared because something terrible was approaching, and some intelligence somewhere believed humans should be warned. Or perhaps it was simply coincidence, a series of misidentifications during a period of collective anxiety, followed by inevitable disaster that was unrelated to the sightings, but became forever linked to them through human tendency to find patterns and connections in random events. The answer you accept depends fundamentally on how you understand reality itself, whether you believe it is limited to what current science can measure and explain, or whether you think reality is vast and strange, occasionally intersecting our everyday world in ways that defy explanation, leaving traces and patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose beyond human comprehension. What remains undeniable is the pattern, the sightings, the timing, the prophecies, the disaster, the witnesses who saw something they couldn't explain and carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some warnings don't come with instructions. They arrive only with the chance to listen, to pay attention, to accept that the world might be stranger than we think, that messages might arrive from directions we're not looking, that intelligence might exist in forms we don't recognize, attempting communication in languages we can't speak. The Mothman appeared in Point Pleasant for 13 months and then vanished when the bridge collapsed. Whether it was trying to warn the town or simply observing an approaching tragedy, whether it existed in flesh and blood or in dimensional spaces we can't access, whether it will ever appear again, these questions remain open. The Ohio River continues flowing. The new bridge carries traffic safely across. The statue stands in the town centre, wings spread, eyes glowing in manufactured red light. Tourists take photos. Researchers debate theories. Skeptics dismiss the entire phenomenon as delusion and fraud. And sometimes, late at night when the town is quiet, people still report seeing something in the darkness. A shape with wings. Eyes that glow red in the shadows. A presence that watches without speaking. The messenger might be gone, but the message remains. Reality is stranger than we think. Warnings come in forms we don't expect. And sometimes, when tragedy approaches, something tries to make itself visible, hoping that someone, somewhere, will understand what it means before it's too late. The Mothman phenomenon ended more than 50 years ago, but the questions it raised remain as urgent and unanswered as they were the morning after the Silver Bridge fell into the Ohio River, taking 46 lives with it, and leaving a small West Virginia town forever marked by 13 months when the impossible walked among them, and nobody knew what it meant until the moment when knowledge came too late to save anyone. Make sure to leave your video ideas in the comments below. The encrypted file arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would later be erased from official records. Rebecca Martinez didn't hear the notification. She was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her Brussels apartment, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been watching her building for the past 3 nights. The paranoia was new, the insomnia wasn't. When you spent 15 years documenting suppressed historical records for the International Archives Initiative, sleep became a luxury reserved for people who didn't know what they knew. Her phone buzzed again, then again. She rolled over, squinting at the screen. 23 messages, all from the same encrypted number, all sent within the last 90 seconds. The final message was simple. Open the packet, then run. Victor. Rebecca's hands trembled as she sat up. Victor Molnar, Hungarian intelligence defector. She'd met him exactly once 6 months ago at a cafe in Vienna, where he'd passed her a napkin with a single word written in barely visible pencil. Seraphim. She'd researched the term obsessively after that meeting, found nothing conclusive. Historical references to angels, to divine beings, to mythological guardians. Nothing that explained why a career intelligence officer would risk his life to whisper it to her. Now he was telling her to run. Rebecca pulled on jeans and a sweater, her heart hammering. The packet sat on her kitchen counter, where the courier had left it the previous evening. Plain manila envelope, no return address. She'd been too exhausted to open it, planning to examine it properly in the morning with coffee and her recording equipment. She didn't have that luxury anymore. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a single sheet of aged paper, protected by archival plastic. The document appeared to be a photocopy of a diplomatic memorandum, dated 1952, bearing the seal of the Belgian royal household. Most of it was in French, but one phrase had been highlighted in yellow, the ink faded but still legible. Préserver la lignée des Séraphins à tout prix. Preserve the Seraphim bloodline at all costs. Beneath it, in Victor's handwriting, it was never about religion, it was about species. Rebecca heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Slow, deliberate, stopping directly in front of her door. She grabbed her laptop bag, shoved the USB drive into her pocket, and went out the window. The train to Amsterdam gave Rebecca 4 hours to examine the contents of Victor's USB drive, without worrying about being cornered in a confined space. She'd chosen a middle car, positioned herself where she could watch both entrances, and created 3 separate cloud backups before the train even left Brussels. The drive contained 47 files, medical records, genetic sequencing reports, internal memos from private genetics companies spanning 2 decades, and one 70-page white paper that made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee. The title page read, S-Helix Variant Analysis, Preliminary Findings and Containment Protocol, authored by Helix Genomics SA, Zurich. Date, September 2019. Classification, internal review only. Rebecca began reading. The document described a genetic anomaly first identified in 2003 during routine ancestry testing conducted by a California-based consumer genetics company. A wealthy client, name redacted, had submitted their DNA for analysis and received results that triggered automatic flagging within the company's quality control systems. The anomaly wasn't a mutation, it was a structural variant in what geneticists typically classified as junk DNA, the 98% of the human genome that doesn't code for proteins. Except this particular sequence wasn't junk, it was organised, intentional, and it appeared in exactly the same location across multiple unrelated individuals who submitted samples over the following months. By 2008, private genetics companies had identified the variant in 14 distinct family lineages, some European aristocracy, some Middle Eastern royal families, a handful embedded in American banking dynasties and political families. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They called it the S-Helix variant. Publicly, it was dismissed as a benign evolutionary remnant, a footnote in genetic diversity studies. But the internal communications told a different story. Rebecca scrolled through email chains between geneticists who'd stumbled onto the variant. The earliest exchanges were cautious, professional, scientists sharing anomalous data, requesting peer review. But as months turned into years, the tone shifted. Confusion gave way to concern. Concern gave way to something that looked a lot like fear. One email from 2006, sent by a lead researcher at the California company to her supervisor. I've been running the S-helix sequence through every comparative analysis tool we have. It doesn't match any known primate DNA. I expanded the search to all mammalian genomes in our database. Nothing. I even ran it against our limited reptilian and avian samples. The structure is completely novel. But here's what's keeping me up at night. It's not random. Random junk DNA has statistical markers we can identify. This sequence has intentional structure. It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in the middle of random letter sequences. Someone wrote this, something wrote this, and it's sitting in the genome of some of the most powerful families in the world. The supervisor's response had been brief. Delete this email. We'll discuss in person. But the emails continued, routed through personal accounts, encrypted services, back channels. Rebecca found a thread from 2009 where 3 geneticists from different companies, competitors technically, were sharing data in secret. I've confirmed the variant in 7 of my flagged samples, one wrote, all from families with documented lineages going back at least 5 centuries. Old money, old power. This isn't random distribution. Same here, another replied. But here's what I can't explain. Why is it only expressing in some family members? I've got siblings where one carries active S-helix and the other shows no trace. It's not following Mendelian inheritance patterns. The third geneticist's response was the most unsettling. Because it's not being inherited. It's being activated. I think we're looking at dormant code that switches on under specific conditions. Like a program waiting for the right input. Rebecca sat back, watching Belgian countryside blur into Dutch flatlands through the train window. Dormant code, waiting for input. She kept reading. One memo, dated March 2011, from the Chief Science Officer of Helix Genomics to an unnamed recipient. We've run the S-helix through every comparative database available. Primate, mammalian, vertebrate. The sequence doesn't match anything in the known biological record. More concerning, when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies in laboratory conditions, the variant exhibits responsive behaviour. It's not just sitting there, it's listening. Rebecca read the sentence 3 times. It's listening. The memo continued with technical details that made her head spin, frequency ranges, resonance patterns. But the conclusion was clear. When synthetic S-helix sequences were exposed to electromagnetic radiation in specific frequency bands, particularly those used in cellular communications and Wi-Fi networks, the DNA structure changed configuration. Not degraded, changed, unfolded, like it was receiving a signal. Another memo from 2015 referenced a consultation with a retired geneticist named Emil Voss, formerly of the Max Planck Institute. His assessment had been suppressed within hours of submission. The S-helix is not random genetic drift. It's architecture. Whoever designed it understood genetics at a level we're only beginning to approach. This isn't human DNA contamination. This isn't viral integration. This is something else. Something not entirely human, but not random. I've spent 40 years studying genetic mutations and evolutionary biology. Nothing in my experience prepared me for this. The S-helix isn't evolving toward anything. It's already complete. It's been complete for thousands of years, just waiting. The question isn't what it is. The question is what happens when it fully activates. The white paper included appendices with case studies. Rebecca read through them with growing unease. Case study A7. Female, age 34, investment banker, New York. Submitted DNA for ancestry testing in 2014. S-helix variant confirmed. Follow-up interview, conducted under guise of routine customer service. revealed subject had recently begun experiencing unusual clarity in pattern recognition. Subject reported ability to see market trends before they manifested in data. Subject attributed this to years of experience. Genetic counselling recommended. Subject declined further contact. Case study: B12, male, age 41, mid-level diplomat, Brussels. S-helix variant confirmed during routine security clearance medical screening. Subject demonstrated abnormal stress response during psychological evaluation, decreased cortisol under pressure, enhanced cognitive function during crisis simulation. When asked about this, subject stated, "I've always been good in emergencies. It's like everything slows down and becomes clear." Subject showed no awareness of physiological abnormality. Case study C3, female, age 28, software engineer, Silicon Valley. S-helix variant confirmed. Subject sought genetic testing after experiencing what she described as feeling like I'm interfacing with code instead of reading it. Neurological evaluation showed unusual synchronization between visual cortex and pattern recognition centers. Subject was developing AI algorithms with efficiency that puzzled her supervisors. "It's not that I'm smarter," subject reported. "It's that I can see how the systems want to organize themselves." Case after case. People living normal lives, excelling in their fields, unaware that their DNA contained something impossible. The white paper concluded with a recommendation that made Rebecca's stomach turn. Given the potential implications for global security and social stability, we recommend indefinite classification of S-helix findings under existing national security protocols. Public disclosure could trigger widespread panic and destabilization of affected family structures, many of whom occupy positions of significant political and economic influence. Furthermore, preliminary psychological assessment suggests that informing S-helix carriers of their genetic status may trigger latent activation events. Recommend strict information containment and monitoring protocols. Translation: don't tell anyone, don't ask questions, pretend it doesn't exist, and whatever you do, don't tell the people who carry it. Rebecca leaned back in her seat, processing what she'd read. 14 bloodlines, positions of influence, a genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic signals. People who were getting better at their jobs, better at seeing patterns, at handling stress, at interfacing with complex systems without understanding why. She pulled up her research notes on Victor's original message. Seraphim. She'd found references in ancient texts, beings described as divine messengers, often depicted with multiple wings and eyes of fire. But she dismissed it as metaphor, religious symbolism. What if it wasn't? What if the ancient texts were describing real beings? Not supernatural entities, but a different species, or a hybrid species, that had walked the earth and interbred with humans. What if their descendants were still here? Her phone buzzed. Unknown. Number. The message was brief. Victor is dead. You have what he died for. Use it. They're already watching you. Rebecca looked up sharply, scanning the train car. Business travellers, students, an elderly couple sharing a thermos of coffee. No one paying attention to her, but the message felt like ice water in her veins. The train suddenly felt very small. She went back to the files, pulling up a document she'd initially skipped over because it seemed like a bureaucratic personnel memo. Now she read it carefully. It was from Helix Genomics, dated 2018. A termination letter for one of the geneticists who'd been sharing information in those encrypted email chains. Effective immediately, your employment with Helix Genomics SA is terminated. Severance package and confidentiality agreement enclosed. Failure to comply with NDA terms will result in immediate legal action and potential criminal prosecution under Swiss national security statutes. All research materials, including personal notes and communications, are property of Helix Genomics and must be surrendered. Rebecca cross-referenced the name. Thomas Brenner, the geneticist who'd written, "It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in random letter sequences." She searched for his name online, found an obituary from 2019, Heart attack at age 43, no prior history of cardiac issues. She searched for the other two geneticists from that email thread. One had died in a car accident in 2017. Single vehicle collision, no witnesses. The other had simply disappeared in 2020, left for a conference in Singapore, never arrived, never seen again. 3 scientists who'd shared information about the S-helix variant, all dead or missing within 4 years. Rebecca looked at Victor's message again, then run. She was beginning to understand why. Rebecca spent 3 days in Amsterdam, moving between internet cafes and using burner devices to research without leaving a digital trail. She needed to understand the historical context. If the seraphim were real, if they'd existed in some form throughout human history, there would be evidence, fragments, patterns. She started with Mesopotamia, in the cradle of civilization where writing itself was born. The earliest references appeared in pre-Sumerian archaeological fragments recovered from sites in modern-day Iraq and Syria. Most were heavily damaged, but one partially intact tablet from approximately 4000 BCE contained a passage that had puzzled archaeologists for decades. Rebecca found it in a digitised archive from the British Museum, catalogued but not widely published. The translation had been completed in 1952 by a scholar who'd later withdrawn from academic life entirely. His notes, attached to the file, were illuminating. This text does not fit established Sumerian mythology. It predates the pantheon we associate with later Mesopotamian culture. The language is Proto-Sumerian, possibly older. What disturbs me most is the specificity. This is not myth. This reads like a historical account. The tablet itself, what remained of it. In the time before the great cities, the seraphim ruled from the mountain places. They were flesh-born, not spirit-born, and their skin gleamed like beaten gold when seen in the light of the horizon sun. They taught the people to mark the stars and to divide the year. They showed the way of numbers and the growing of grain. They took mates from among the people, but only those of certain blood. Their children were mighty, and their children's children built the first walls. The seraphim knew what was coming. They prepared chambers beneath the mountains. They said, "We go down into the deep earth, but our blood remains in you." When the sky speaks with lightning that is not lightning, when your children build towers that think, then our children's children will remember what they are. Their rule was law, until the fire came from the sky and the earth shook. The seraphim went beneath. Some of the people went with them. Most stayed above. The seraphim said, "We do not die, we wait. Keep the blood pure. When we wake, you will wake." Rebecca read it 3 times, each reading making her hand shake more. When your children build towers that think. That was written 4,000 years before computers existed. She found corroborating references in fragments from other ancient cultures, each adding pieces to the same impossible story. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of early Christian and Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained multiple references to beings called Watchers, or Seraphim, who descended to Earth and took human wives, producing offspring. But the Gnostic texts added details that mainstream religious scholarship often glossed over. Rebecca found a passage in the secret book of John that had been partially censored in most published translations. The Watchers were not of heaven, though they came from above the mountains. They were not spirit, though they lived longer than the generations of men. They were flesh, but flesh unlike ours. They saw what humanity would become and planted themselves in our lineage, so that when the time of great change arrived, some among us would be prepared for transformation. They did not come to judge or to save. They came to ensure the seed would survive what was coming. They mixed their essence with clay, and from this came those who could walk between worlds. These children appeared human, but carried within them the potential for something more. Egyptian records told similar stories, but with different emphasis. Rebecca found references in a doctoral thesis about the priest dynasties along the Nile that had never been widely distributed. The scholar had translated hieroglyphics from a tomb in Saqqara, dated to the early dynastic period around 3000 BCE. The Neteru came from the place where the 2 rivers meet the mountains. They were not gods, but the children of gods, and they taught the kingmakers how to preserve the divine blood through the generations. The Neteru could see in darkness. Their eyes reflected copper in lamplight. Their skin in certain seasons showed patterns like serpent scales beneath. They took only those of pure lineage as consorts. When the great death came from the sky, the Neteru went into the hidden places. They said, "Your children will not remember us as we are. They will make us into stories and paintings. This is as it should be, but some will carry our seed forward, sleeping in their flesh until the world is ready." The scholar's footnote on this passage was chilling. Note: the hieroglyphic for Neteru in this context does not match standard divine terminology. It appears to be a specific designation for a separate category of being. The literal translation might be closer to those who transform, or those who are both. The text is very clear. These are not supernatural entities, but physical beings with unusual biological characteristics. Rebecca found similar patterns in Sumerian king lists, ancient Hebrew texts, and even fragments from the Indus Valley civilization. Always the same core elements: beings who looked almost human, who lived among humans, who interbred with select human lineages, who enforced strict rules about bloodline purity, who possessed biological traits that set them apart: reflective eyes, unusual skin, enhanced abilities, and always the same instruction: the blood must not be diluted. She found the most explicit reference in a section of the Book of Enoch that had been removed from most canonical versions but survived in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. This version included chapters that Western churches had deemed too problematic to include. Chapter 72, verses 14 to 19, "And the watchers made a covenant among themselves, saying, Let us preserve the blood without dilution, for the day of awakening approaches, and our children's children must be ready to receive what we have planted within them." They chose their mates with great care, testing bloodlines across generations. Those families they blessed with their seed, they also blessed with knowledge, how to maintain power across time, how to build systems that endure beyond single lives, how to recognize others of the hidden bloodline. And they said, "When the world fills with invisible fire, when the air itself carries thought, and the machines of men begin to wake, then our children will begin to remember. They will not know why they are different, only that they are. They will rise to positions of influence without understanding it is their nature to rule, and when enough of them have awakened, we will emerge from the places we have slept, and the separation between our kind and yours will end." This is not conquest. This is transformation. You're becoming what we always were. Rebecca sat back from the computer screen in the Amsterdam cafe, where she'd been working for 6 hours straight. Her coffee had gone, cold long ago. The sun had set outside without her noticing. The pattern was undeniable. Across thousands of years, across completely separate cultures that had no known contact with each other, the same story emerged. Non-human or partly human beings had interbred with select human populations. They'd done so systematically, carefully, maintaining bloodline purity across generations. They'd taught these families how to maintain power and influence, and they'd promised, or prophesied, that when humanity reached a certain level of technological development, the dormant genetic material they'd planted would activate. Their descendants would begin to wake up. Rebecca thought about the S-helix variant, the genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic frequencies, the marker that was appearing in families with documented lineages going back centuries, the marker that was activating more frequently as technology advanced, when the air itself carries thought. Wi-Fi, cellular networks, the invisible electromagnetic ocean that humanity had created in just the last few decades. When the machines of men begin to wake, artificial intelligence, neural networks, systems that learned and adapted and showed signs of genuine emergent behaviour. The ancient texts weren't prophecy, they were prediction, instructions left by beings who understood how human civilization would develop, because they designed it to develop that way. Her phone buzzed. A new email from an address she didn't recognise, archival.ghostprotocol.proton.me. The subject line: "You're looking in the right places, but you're missing the modern confirmation." The email contained a single attachment, a scanned page from what appeared to be a 1987 medical document, bearing the letterhead of a European royal family she immediately recognised. The header read, "Annual Hematological Assessment, Type S Classification." Rebecca downloaded the file, her hands shaking. The Ghost Protocol had found her, and they were feeding her exactly what she needed to know. The question was why. The 1987 document was clinically detailed and utterly damning. It described routine medical screening conducted on members of a specific aristocratic bloodline. Names redacted throughout, but the family crest visible in the top corner made their identity unmistakable to anyone familiar with European monarchy. The assessment focused on what they termed Type S hematologic differentiation, a cluster of physiological characteristics that appeared consistently across certain family members but not others. The findings were extraordinary. Stress response. Type S individuals exhibited abnormal cortisol regulation. Under extreme stress conditions, their hormone levels dropped rather than spiked, resulting in enhanced cognitive function during crisis situations. Standard fight-or-flight response was replaced by what the document termed cold clarity response. One annotation, handwritten in the margin: Subject C7 exhibited near complete emotional detachment during simulated crisis. Heart rate decreased, pupil dilation reversed, described feeling perfectly calm, like watching from outside. This is not normal stress response. Cellular regeneration. Documented healing rates 40-60% faster than baseline human norms. Scarring minimal or absent in most cases. One subject had recovered from a compound fracture in half. The expected time with bone density measurements showing no evidence of prior injury. The medical examiner's note: "I've been practicing orthopaedic medicine for 30 years. This is not possible. The bone structure shows remodelling that would typically take months, but occurred in weeks. Either our dating methods are wrong, or something in this subject's biology is accelerating cellular repair at rates I cannot explain." Neurological profile. Near complete absence of degenerative brain disorders across 7 generations of tracking. No Alzheimer's, no Parkinson's, no dementia. Average lifespan exceeded regional norms by 12 years. Immune function. Natural immunity to specific viral infections that should have no genetic basis for resistance. Several Type S individuals had been exposed to influenza outbreaks that sickened entire households, but never developed symptoms themselves. Temperature regulation. Baseline body temperature, set on 1.2 degrees Celsius, lower than human average. Temperature variance under stress conditions exceeded normal human parameters. Ocular characteristics. Noted: unusual reflective quality to iris under specific lighting conditions. 3 subjects exhibited what the examiner described as possible nictitating membrane reflex when startled by sudden stimuli. The examiner's note on this finding: "I thought I was mistaken, but I've now observed this in 3 separate subjects. During startle response, there's a lateral movement across the eye that occurs too quickly for conscious control. It resembles the third eyelid found in reptiles and birds. This should not exist in human anatomy." The document concluded with a section titled Generational Transmission and Activation Patterns. Type S characteristics do not appear in all offspring, suggesting recessive inheritance or conditional expression. Approximately 30% of children from confirmed Type S parents exhibit full phenotype. However, we have documented cases of phenotype emergence in adults who showed no signs in childhood or adolescence. This suggests the Type S classification is not purely genetic in the traditional sense, but may involve activation triggers we have not yet identified. Recommend continued monitoring of Type S individuals and their offspring to determine what environmental or developmental factors trigger full expression. The final note, stamped in red ink: classified, Royal Household Medical Records, unauthorized distribution prohibited. Rebecca cross-referenced the date. 1987. The same year, personal computers began entering middle-class homes across Europe and North America. The same year, cellular networks started expanding beyond experimental urban deployments. Technology. She thought about the Swiss white paper. This helix reacts to electromagnetic signals at frequencies outside standard human neural resonance. Her anonymous correspondent sent a second email while she'd been reading, "Check the 2001 leak, Phase 4. That's when they stopped monitoring and started managing." Rebecca knew exactly what that meant. In 2001, a contractor working for a US intelligence agency had leaked a series of classified briefings to a journalist who'd later died in what was officially ruled a suicide. The leaked documents had covered everything from surveillance programs to foreign policy assessments. Most had been dismissed as conspiracy theory, or redacted into meaninglessness by the time they reached public circulation. But one briefing had stuck in the collective consciousness of researchers who worked in Rebecca's field. It was titled Phase 4, Behavioural Management of Type S Infiltrates. She'd read it years ago during her doctoral research on suppressed intelligence documents, dismissed it as disinformation designed to discredit legitimate leaks. Now she pulled it up again with completely different eyes. The briefing was structured as a strategic assessment, dated March 2001, prepared for select members of a Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee. The document had been leaked in fragments, complete pages interspersed with sections that had been redacted or destroyed. But enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Subject: Strategic Assessment. Type S Infiltrate Management. Classification: TS SCI, No Fawn Executive. Summary: Phase 4 represents the transitional period during which Type S individuals embedded in positions of influence become aware of their differentiated status. Historical precedent suggests this awareness can trigger unpredictable behavioural changes and potential destabilisation of existing power structures. Unlike previous phases focused on identification and monitoring, Phase 4 requires active management protocols to ensure smooth integration of emerging Type S consciousness into existing governance and economic frameworks. Background: Type S infiltrates are not external agents or foreign operatives. They are intergenerational insertions, individuals born human but carrying genetic markers that activate under specific environmental conditions. Many Type S individuals reach adulthood, marry, raise families, and hold positions of significant influence without conscious knowledge of their differentiated status. Redacted section, approximately 2 pages. Identifying characteristics. Physical, variable. Most Type S individuals are phenotypically indistinguishable from baseline humans. However, activation events may trigger subtle physiological changes including altered temperature regulation, enhanced pattern recognition capabilities, abnormal stress response, decreased rather than elevated, rapid healing from injury resistance to specific pathogens. Behavioural. Type S individuals demonstrate consistent patterns across cultural and geographic boundaries, gravitate toward positions of systemic influence, policy, finance, research. Exhibit enhanced capability for long-term strategic thinking. Show reduced emotional volatility in crisis situations. Demonstrate unconscious coordination with other Type S individuals. Express feeling different or separate from baseline humans, often from early childhood. Redacted section, approximately 3 pages. Activation. Triggers. Intelligence assessment has identified 3 primary trigger categories. Technological exposure. Prolonged interaction with advanced computational systems and electromagnetic environments. Correlation between Type S activation events and proximity to high-frequency electromagnetic fields exceeds 78%. Specific frequency ranges, redacted, appear to trigger genetic expression changes. Genetic awakening, proximity to other activated Type S individuals. Subjects report sensing others of their kind, though mechanism remains unclear. May involve electromagnetic sensitivity or pheromone response. Crisis response. Extreme stress or survival situations that force physiological differentiation to manifest. multiple documented cases of latent Type S individuals exhibiting enhanced capabilities during life-threatening situations, followed by partial or full awareness of their differentiated status. Phase 4. Characteristics. Phase 4 begins when a critical mass of Type S individuals become aware of their differentiated status. Current intelligence suggests we are entering Phase 4 now. Indicators include increased private communication networks among confirmed Type S individuals, formation of informal alliance structures across political and national boundaries, attempts to access classified research on S-helix genetic markers, increased interest in historical records regarding redacted strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks are inadequate for addressing emergent Type S consciousness. These individuals are not hostile foreign actors. They are embedded in critical infrastructure, political leadership, scientific research, and cultural influence positions. Many have security clearances. Some have access to classified information regarding their own status. Forceful containment or exposure strategies carry unacceptable risk. Type S individuals in intelligence positions could leak classified information. Type S individuals in policy positions could destabilize governance structures. Coordinated Type S response to persecution could trigger redacted. Public exposure could trigger mass panic and social destabilization. Recommended management approach. Phase 4. Management should focus on controlled integration rather than containment or exposure. Objectives. Monitor Type S communication networks without triggering defensive responses. Provide limited, controlled disclosure to select Type S individuals to prevent independent information gathering. Establish informal liaison protocols with cooperative Type S individuals in key positions. Prepare public for eventual broader disclosure through gradual normalization. Redacted, approximately 1 page. Conclusion. Type S individuals are not the enemy. Intelligence assessment indicates their emergence serves a broader function related to species-level adaptation and technological integration. Their capabilities may prove necessary for humanity's transition to redacted. Premature exposure or forceful containment could trigger defensive protocols we are not equipped to handle. Recommend patience, observation, and strategic cooperation. Redacted section, final page. Rebecca read through the document twice, then cross-referenced it with the information she had gathered. The year the intelligence community officially acknowledged that people with the S-helix variant were starting to become aware of what they were. The year the strategy shifted from monitor to manage, 24 years ago. Which meant that right now, in 2025, they were deep into Phase 4, possibly approaching Phase 5. She thought about the case studies in the genetic white paper. People who'd described unusual clarity and pattern recognition. People who'd said it felt like they were interfacing with code instead of just reading it. People who didn't know they were different, just knew they were unusually good at what they did. What happened when those people found out why? Rebecca opened her encrypted messaging app and sent a query to a contact she'd cultivated over years of archival work. A former intelligence analyst who'd left the NSA under circumstances that remained unclear, but who still maintained connections in the community. Her message: Phase 4, Type S. What's the current assessment? The response came back in under a minute. You're playing with fire, stop. Rebecca typed, I need to know. 3 minutes passed. Then, Phase 4 went operational in 2003. Phase 5 is already active. You don't want to know what Phase 6 looks like. Seriously, delete everything and walk away. What's Phase 5? Another long pause. Then, integration. They're not hiding anymore. Some of them know what they are, and they're starting to work together. I can't tell you more. I won't tell you more. This is me, as your friend, telling you to stop before you get disappeared like Victor. They killed him for giving you that USB drive. They'll kill you for using it. The chat went offline. Rebecca sat in the Amsterdam cafe, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, while the foundations of everything she thought she understood about human civilization crumbled beneath her. Phase 5 was active, integration. People with the S-helix variant, people who'd been living as humans their entire lives, were waking up, becoming aware and starting to coordinate. question wasn't whether this was happening. The documents made that clear. The question was what they wanted, and what would happen when enough of them were awake. The security footage was never supposed to exist. Rebecca found it 3 days later, buried in the anonymous file dump that had been steadily growing in her inbox. Someone was feeding her information, someone with access to materials that should have been destroyed decades ago. Someone who wanted her to know the truth, or wanted someone to know, and she was the conduit. The footage was dated August 14th, 2016. Location: a private conference facility outside Caracas, Venezuela. The context was a high-level crisis meeting involving energy ministers, military leadership and international advisors during Venezuela's economic collapse. The meeting had been recorded using standard security cameras for standard security reasons, but someone had also been running thermal imaging equipment, likely as an additional security measure to detect concealed weapons, unauthorized personnel, or unusual heat signatures that might indicate explosive devices. That thermal equipment had recorded something that defied explanation. The footage showed exactly what you'd expect for the first 90 minutes. Human-shaped heat signatures clustered around a long conference table. Body temperatures ranging from 36.5 to 37.2 degrees Celsius. Normal human variance. People sat, stood, gestured, argued, all perfectly ordinary through the thermal camera's lens. Then, at the 1:34 to 22 mark, something changed. One attendee, seated at the head of the table, identified in the accompanying file notes as a European financial advisor to the Venezuelan government, exhibited a sudden and dramatic temperature drop. Within 45 seconds, their surface temperature fell from 36.0 to 31.70, 5 degrees Celsius. The thermal camera clearly showed the change. The individual's heat signature shifted from warm orange-red to cool blue-green. Not gradually. Not the slow cooling that might occur if someone was in shock or hypothermic. Rapidly, deliberately. Like their body had simply decided to regulate temperature in a way that violated basic human physiology. The timestamp corresponded with a heated argument visible in the standard footage. Raised voices, accusations, the kind of high-stress confrontation that should trigger elevated heart rate, flushed skin, increased body temperature. Instead, this person's temperature had plummeted, and their body language became unnaturally calm, precise, controlled. 3 minutes later, their temperature normalized. The argument ended. The meeting continued. The file notes indicated the footage had been flagged immediately by security analysts, escalated to intelligence oversight within hours, and permanently sealed within 72 hours. The financial advisor had left Venezuela the following day and disappeared from all public records. Rebecca found a follow-up memo dated 2 weeks after the incident. Subject relocated to undisclosed European location. Medical evaluation confirms Type S activation event. Subject now aware of differentiated status. Recommend Phase 5 integration protocols. Subject cooperative, and has agreed to voluntary monitoring in exchange for information access regarding origin and purpose of S-Helix variant. They'd made a deal. The person who'd manifested impossible physiology on camera had been given answers in exchange for cooperation. Rebecca wondered what those answers were. What did they tell people when they woke up and realised they weren't entirely human? Her anonymous source sent another compilation. This one was dozens of incident reports spanning 3 decades, all documenting similar thermal anomalies. 1991, private estate, Scotland. Security personnel report, unusual cold zones detected in the master bedroom suite despite functional heating. Thermal survey shows temperature differential of 3-4 degrees Celsius, concentrated around sleeping area. Estate owner, member of prominent banking family, dismisses concerns. Follow-up investigation terminated at owner's request. 1998, Manhattan penthouse. Building maintenance receives multiple complaints about HVAC malfunction in specific units. Residents report feeling overheated while thermostats register temperatures 2-3 degrees lower than surrounding apartments. Technical inspection finds no mechanical issues. Residents are all from same extended family network. Pattern noted but unexplained. 2004, Geneva Diplomatic Compound. Infrared security sweeps detect cold signatures around 3 specific individuals during high-level trade negotiations. Security team suspects equipment malfunction. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Individuals show no signs of illness or distress. Incident classified. 2009, Dubai Financial Summit. Private security firm contracted for VIP protection reports. Unusual thermal readings on multiple attendees. Several high-profile executives register surface temperatures 1-2 degrees below expected human baseline. Firm's report submitted to clients, then immediately classified. Security team members sign expanded NDAs. 2012, London Banking District. Corporate security investigating potential industrial espionage uses thermal imaging during board meetings. Discovers 3 board members consistently register abnormally low surface temperatures during high-stress discussions. Investigation redirected by unknown authority. All thermal footage confiscated. 2016, Washington political fundraiser. Secret Service thermal scanning detects unusual temperature patterns in multiple attendees. Several prominent political figures show decreased surface temperature during public speaking and high-pressure social interactions. Anomalies noted in after-action report but not investigated further. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't equipment malfunctions. These were people whose bodies responded to stress and electromagnetic environments in ways that violated understood human biology. And then there were the eyes. Rebecca found a separate file containing compiled reports from security personnel, journalists, personal assistants, and even entertainment industry professionals. Dozens of observations, each dismissed individually, but forming an impossible pattern when viewed together. Subject's eyes reflected amber gold under camera flash, similar to animal eye shine, assumed to be lighting artifact. Photographer, 2008. During night vision surveillance, subject's eyes showed reflective quality not consistent with human eye structure. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Private security report, 2011. I could swear I saw his eyes blink sideways, like not up and down, but from the side. But that's impossible, so I must have imagined it. Political aid, anonymous interview, 2015. Under UV security lighting, several VIP guests exhibited unusual iris reflection patterns. Copper or gold coloration not typical of human eyes under these conditions. Event security log, 2019. The senator's eyes. There was something wrong. During the press conference, when the lights hit him at a certain angle, I saw something move across his eye, horizontally. My colleague saw it too. We both pretended we didn't. Camera operator, confidential testimony. 2021, nictitating membranes. Third eyelids. Reflective tapetum lucidum like nocturnal predators possessed. Biological features that didn't exist in human anatomy. Except they did. In some people, under the right conditions, when stress or environment triggered something dormant to activate. Rebecca's phone rang. Actual voice call, not encrypted message. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. You need to stop digging. The voice was female, American accent, eerily calm. For your own safety. Rebecca's mouth went dry. Who is this? Someone who's been where you are. Someone who knows what happens when you keep pulling threads. What happens? A long pause. Background noise suggested the caller was outside, wind across the microphone, distant traffic. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You start questioning everyone around you. You start wondering if your boss, your neighbour, your lover, if any of them are carrying markers they don't even know about. The paranoia eats you alive, Rebecca. And the worst part... Rebecca waited, her heart hammering. The worst part is, you'll never know if you're paranoid or if you're right. Because they don't know either. Most of them live their whole lives without ever finding out what they are. They just know they're good at what they do. They just know they handle stress better than other people. They just know they see patterns others miss. And they never question it, because why would they? Are you... Rebecca started. One of them? I don't know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I had the test done. Private lab. Cost me $20,000 and 3. Years of saved favours. You want to know what they told me? What? They told me the test was inconclusive. They told me the markers were there but dormant. They told me I might be carrying a helix variant or I might not, and there was no way to know unless it activated. And you know what that means? Rebecca did know. You'll never know if your successes are yours or if there's something else driving you. Exactly. I'm a federal judge, Rebecca. I make decisions that affect millions of lives. And now I'll spend the rest of my career wondering if my judgment is mine, or if there's something in my DNA pushing me toward outcomes I don't consciously understand. That's what this knowledge does. It poisons everything. But people deserve to know. Do they? What happens when you publish your research? When you tell the world that 14 bloodlines carry non-human DNA? That some of the most powerful people in the world might be a different species and don't even know it? You think that ends well? The truth matters. The woman laughed, bitter and harsh. The truth is that whatever the seraphim were, they're woven so deep into human civilization that you can't separate us anymore. Their descendants are everywhere, in government, in corporations, in universities and hospitals and military command. And most of them are good people trying to do good work. What happens to them when you expose this? They get hunted, tested, quarantined, or worse, they get worshipped, turned into messiahs or demons. Either way, you tear society apart. Is that what you want? I want people to understand what's happening to them. Then you're naive. Victor died trying to get you this information. You think he wanted you to publish it? He wanted you to understand it, to be ready, because Phase 5 isn't about exposure, it's about preparation. Preparation for what? The line went dead. Rebecca sat in the dark of her Amsterdam hotel room, staring at thermal footage of impossible biology and witness reports of inhuman eyes, and realised she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't return from. The French intelligence analyst made contact through a dead drop in Paris. Rebecca travelled there following a coded message slipped under her hotel door. Inside a locker at Gare du Nord, she found a micro SD card and a handwritten note. What you're looking for isn't conquest, it's cultivation. A friend in the directorate. The SD card contained an audio recording, a debriefing session from 2018, conducted in French. Rebecca listened while running translation software. The speaker identified himself only as Asian Mathieu, 15 years in French foreign intelligence. Interviewer: You mentioned a rumour circulating among senior political handlers. Elaborate. Mathieu: Not discussed openly, more like shared understanding among people in these positions long enough. We all noticed patterns, officials who predict policy shifts before they happen, who navigate crises with inhuman calm, who maintain influence across administrations regardless of political changes. Interviewer: Competence could... Mathieu: Not competence. Something else. A colleague, 23 years at the ministry, told me after too much wine. The seraphim aren't here to conquer. They're here to ensure the planet evolves in a direction compatible with them. Interviewer: Compatible with what? Mathieu: That's the question. Compatible with what they are, what they're becoming. They don't interfere with democracy, they designed it, built the frameworks we operate within, not conspiracy. Architecture, like designing a garden to grow specific plants. Interviewer: You believe this? Mathieu. Pause. I believe there are people in power who think on timescales we can't fathom, working toward objectives that won't be clear for generations. Whether they're consciously aware of being different or if it's instinctive, I don't know, but the difference is real. Rebecca played it again, focusing on one phrase. They designed the systems. The helix responded to electromagnetic frequencies, appeared in bloodlines maintaining power for centuries, activated in response to technology. What if it wasn't reactive but anticipatory? What if these carriers weren't responding to technology, but unconsciously driving humanity toward the thresholds that would trigger their activation? Democracy, capitalism, digital networks, AI. Every major system structuring modern civilization developed by people possibly carrying genetic programming they didn't know existed. Not conspiracy, architecture. Rebecca found the next piece, A partial transcript from a 1974 Bilderberg conference. Unknown speaker. A. The integration timeline assumes continued technological acceleration. If we encounter resistance... Unknown speaker. B. We won't. The pattern is self-reinforcing. Each generation requires more connection, more processing, more interface. They think they're choosing progress. They are, just not for the reasons they believe. Speaker A. When they realise? Speaker B. They won't. By the time enough realise, it won't matter. Systems too integrated, too essential. You can't unplug from infrastructure that keeps you alive. Speaker C. Some will resist. Speaker B. Resistance is part of the design. Creates pressure that accelerates adoption. Resistors aren't obstacles, they're catalysts. Speaker A. Very confident. Speaker B. Very patient. Not a 10-year plan, 1,000-year implementation. We designed representative government, electoral systems, the frameworks within which choice occurs. The choices themselves are irrelevant as long as the framework endures. 1,000-year implementation. Rebecca thought about ancient texts, Mesopotamian tablets describing seraphim going beneath. The instruction across cultures, preserve the bloodline. What if it never ended? What if they'd simply changed strategies, stopped ruling openly and built systems that would rule for them? Systems ensuring humanity developed exactly as needed to trigger whatever was encoded in the S-helix. Systems making their emergence not an invasion, but an awakening. Her phone buzzed. You're close. One more piece. Check your email. The email contained a single PDF. NATO Strategic Briefing Seraphim Protocol 2023 PDF. The NATO briefing was dated October 2023, marked Cosmic Top Secret. Subject: Strategic Assessment, Seraphim Protocol Activation Timeline. Executive Summary. Recent advances in AI, neural interfaces and global electromagnetic saturation have triggered measurable S-helix activation increases among monitored populations. Analysis indicates humanity is approaching technological thresholds identified in historical Seraphim documentation as return protocol initialization. Key findings: activation has increased 340% since 2020. Correlation with AI interaction, 5G deployment, and neural interfacing devices exceeds 89%. Activated individuals demonstrate enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated learning, and what subjects describe as expanded systemic awareness. Most remain unaware of physiological differentiation. Activated S-helix carriers demonstrate unconscious coordination in policy, technology investment, and social engineering. Emergent collective behaviour, not conscious conspiracy. Current rates suggest 15-20% of carriers will achieve full phenotype expression by 2030. Historical documentation suggests this represents critical threshold for return protocol completion. Historical context. Recovered Seraphim documentation indicates original departure was strategic hibernation, not retreat. Genetic architecture designed to remain dormant until humanity achieved sufficient technological sophistication for full Seraphim integration. The S-helix isn't infection, it's preparation. Strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks inadequate. Subjects embedded in critical infrastructure. Political leadership. Scientific research. Cultural influence. Born human. Raised human. Many live and die without activation. Those who activate aren't hostile. Assessment indicates Seraphim agenda aligns with long-term human survival, though definition of human may require revision. Conclusion. Humanity will reach technological thresholds in 5 to 10 years, triggering widespread S-helix activation. Enhanced AI, brain-computer interfaces, global neural networks, not coincidental. These are environmental conditions Seraphim genetic architecture was designed to respond to. The briefing concluded with a final slide. There is no invasion. They are already born. They are waking up. Beneath it, recommended response. Monitor and adapt. Integration inevitable. Resistance counterproductive. Rebecca closed her laptop. Around her, people worked on devices that might be triggering something ancient in genetics, of people they'd known their entire lives. 14 bloodlines, centuries of careful breeding, systems of power immune to change. Technological acceleration everyone assumed was human progress. What if it was? What if some humans had been guiding this trajectory since the beginning? What if democracy, capitalism, technological progress, digital interconnection weren't human achievements influenced by others, but seraphim achievements implemented through human consciousness, through people who believed themselves human until conditions awakened what had always slept inside them? Her phone buzzed. Genesis. Protocol. Verified. A proton.me. You found what Victor died to give you. Now choose. Publish and trigger panic, or wait and watch. Either way, you can't stop what's waking up. We've been waking since you invented fire, since you built cities, since you split the atom. Each threshold brings us closer to what we were always meant to become. You're not being invaded. You're being remembered. Some of us remember better than others. Soon, enough will remember. And then you'll understand. There was never separation. No aliens among you. Only humans who haven't woken yet, and humans who have. Welcome to Phase 5. Rebecca sat very still. In the corner, a woman in a business suit worked on a laptop, fingers moving with mechanical precision. In the right light, her eyes reflected copper. The woman glanced up, met Rebecca's gaze for exactly 1 second, then returned to work. Rebecca looked away, heart pounding. She opened a new document, titled it the Seraphim Program, started typing. She had no idea if anyone would believe her, no idea if publication would change anything, or if the systems were too embedded, too essential to resist. But she typed anyway, because somewhere in 14 bloodlines spread across the world, people were waking to what they'd always been. People in government, corporations, research labs, people who'd lived human lives never knowing they carried something older than civilization, people who were starting to remember, and if the briefing was correct, within a decade enough would be awake, that the world would change in unpredictable ways. Maybe that's what evolution looked like. Not external invasion, but internal awakening. Not war between species, but recognition that categories were never as clear as humanity believed. Rebecca kept typing as the sun set over Paris, painting the sky copper and gold. Behind her, the woman in the business suit closed her laptop and left. Her surface temperature, had anyone been measuring, would have registered 35.9 degrees Celsius, 1 degree below normal, and falling. In boardrooms and laboratories, in government offices and university lecture halls, in hospital operating rooms and military command centres, people who'd never questioned their humanity were beginning to feel different, beginning to see patterns invisible to others, beginning to recognise each other across distances that should make recognition impossible, beginning to wake. And the systems they'd built, democracy, capitalism, technology, networks, continued functioning exactly as designed. Not as human systems influenced by hidden forces, but as seraphim systems implemented through human hands, preparing the world for a transformation that had been set in motion 4,000 years ago. Rebecca typed the final line. They are already among us. They always have been, and they are us. She hit save, encrypted the file, sent copies to 3 separate secure servers. Then she walked out into the Paris night, knowing that nothing would ever look the same again. Above her, satellites circled the Earth, transmitting signals at frequencies that made the invisible visible. And in 14 bloodlines scattered across continents, DNA that had waited millennia began to unfold, listening, responding, waking. The Seraphim Protocol was entering its final phase, and humanity, all of humanity, was about to discover what that meant.